A king dies from laughter, another from dessert. One is murdered in a church, another by his own toilet. This isn't mythology, it's monarchy. Across centuries, crowned heads have fallen not by glory, but by absurdity, poisoned, trampled, exploded, or undone by a pastry too far. These aren't noble deaths. They're bizarre, grotesque, sometimes funny, and always unforgettable. Welcome to the dark, ironic theater of royalty where the only thing more dramatic than power is how it ends. This is 50 most bizarre royal deaths in history. And no, you couldn't make this stuff up. Before we dive headfirst into exploding thrones and fatal monkey bites, make sure you're subscribed because Royal Chaos this weird deserves a front row seat. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what unholy hour is it as you listen to kings meet their oddly specific ends? King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. There are many ways to die as a king. You can fall to assassins in the shadows, perish on a battlefield waving your nation's flag, or disappear into the annals of history with all the pageantry a royal funeral can buy. But then there's Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, who died not with a sword in his hand or a crown on his head, but with a spoon in his mouth. It was 1771, and King Adolf Fredrik was feeling festive. It was Shrove Tuesday, the traditional pre-Lenten feast day, and he leaned into the celebration with the enthusiasm of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to eat. The royal menu, presumably crafted by chefs too terrified to suggest moderation, featured a spread more suitable for a battalion than a single sovereign. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne. And to top it off, 14 servings of Semla Swedish cream buns soaked in hot milk. 14, not 13, which would be gluttonous. Not 15, which might have seemed cartoonish. 14, just enough to become a cautionary tale. Officially, his death was attributed to indigestion. Unofficially, it was a culinary mutiny, a rebellion waged by cream and crust and too many silver platters. Historians and physicians have spent centuries dancing around the cause of death, but at some point, one has to admit, the man overdosed on dessert. It's easy to joke, of course. The death of a monarch via pastry does lend itself to a certain comic absurdity. But beneath the whipped cream and irony lies a deeper story, one of indulgence, of a king who reigned with more appetite than ambition. Adolf Fredrik had long been a figurehead with limited power, a ruler more ornamental than operative, trapped between the ambitions of his ministers and the limits of a constitution. In the end, he couldn't control his country, so perhaps he controlled his plate. And so the monarch who was too soft for politics and too decorative for war found his legacy carved into the crust of a dessert. In Sweden, schoolchildren still joke about him as the king who ate himself to death, a tidy punchline. But punchlines have a habit of lingering and evolving. Because just when you think dying of dessert is strange, history serves you a second course. A king whose final breath came not from sugar overload, but from uncontrollable laughter. King Martin of Aragon. King Martin of Aragon didn't go out with a whimper, a bang, or a solemn, candlelit final decree. He exited the stage of life mid-laugh, somewhere between indigestion and a well-timed punchline. And, in the most bizarre royal fashion, his death was less a tragedy and more of a cosmic joke timed perfectly for maximum absurdity, as if history itself had a twisted sense of humor and impeccable comedic timing. The year was 1410. Martin was elderly, ailing, and frankly over it. His health had been declining, and by all accounts he wasn't expecting to be around much longer. But what no one could have predicted was that his final enemy wouldn't be war, nor poison, nor some obscure medieval disease, but the convergence of bad digestion and a court jester with a surprisingly strong punchline. As the story goes, King Martin had spent the day nursing an upset stomach, not uncommon for the time, considering the medieval diet included everything from questionable meats to more wine than water. He retired to his chambers, groaning and bloated, waiting on the arrival of his court jester to lift his spirits, presumably in the same way a man dying of thirst might request a glass of brandy. When the jester finally arrived, Martin asked him where he had been. The jester replied, "I was in the next vineyard, where I saw a young deer hanging by its tail from a tree, as if someone had punished it for stealing figs. It wasn't exactly Oscar Wilde, but it did the trick." Martin laughed. A deep, prolonged, uncontrollable belly, laugh the kind that shakes your ribs and pulls at your gut. And then, suddenly, he stopped laughing, because he was dead. The cause was never officially determined, but the consensus is that the fatal cocktail was a mix of digestive distress and respiratory failure from laughing too hard. Laughter as a weapon, who knew? In another life, Martin might have survived the stomachache, or the joke, but not both. Together, they proved fatally ironic. One could say he died happy. Or perhaps more precisely, he died at the moment happiness turned toxic. A monarch's death is usually heavy with symbolism, but here, the symbolism mocks itself. A king laughing himself into oblivion in a dimly lit room, his power waning, his crown metaphorically slipping, while jesters deliver their final blow, not with daggers, but with absurdity. And still, something lingers, something darker. Because while Martin's death was absurd, what followed was worse, a succession crisis, years of political chaos, and the realization that behind the laughter, no one had planned for what came next. Which brings us to another king, one whose death wasn't a laughing matter, unless, of course, your sense of humor runs very, very dark. And if you're still here 2 royals down, 48 to go ahead and subscribe. Trust me, it only gets stranger from here. While you're at it, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it as you witness monarchs drop like flies in the weirdest ways imaginable? King Edward II of England. There are deaths that inspire ballads, and there are deaths that become whispered warnings in medieval corridors. Then there's the death of King Edward III monarch, whose name survives in textbooks, largely due to how brutally and bizarrely he may have exited the world. Emphasis on may have. Because in Edward's case, the only thing more grotesque than the alleged cause of death is how little we can prove about it. Let's begin with the man himself, Edward II of England, son of the infamous Longshanks, heir to a brutal legacy of conquest, repression, and political calculation. But Edward wasn't his father. He was softer in every sense emotionally, militarily, even aesthetically. He preferred manual labor and rustic hobbies over war councils. He was more interested in his inner circle of companions, especially his favorite, Piers Gavestonthon, in the heavy mechanics of rule. Parliament wasn't amused, neither were the barons. Royal power, after all, was supposed to look like a sword, not a lute. His reign unraveled spectacularly. England's elite despised his favoritism, especially toward men they considered beneath him. His military efforts, especially his catastrophic loss at Bannockburns, meanted him as a king more ridiculed than revered. Eventually, the resentment fermented into rebellion. Led by his own wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, Edward was captured, imprisoned, and, well, here's where history either smirks or grimaces. According to some accounts, written after the fact, and suspiciously dramatic, Edward was murdered in Berkeley Castle in 1327. But this wasn't a dagger under the pillow situation. The story goes that, to avoid leaving external marks on the body, the assassins chose a method both elaborate and symbolically cruel: a red-hot poker inserted into the rectum. The implication was clear vengeance not just on the king, but on the perceived indignity of his personal life. Whether true or not, the method became infamous. But here's the uncomfortable twist. We don't actually know if it happened. Some records claim Edward survived in secret, living out his days in exile. Others insist he died of natural cause or was smothered in bed. The poker story only appears later, suspiciously convenient in its moralistic overtones. The truth is smeared beneath layers of propaganda, shame, and medieval fan fiction. Still, the legend stuck, not because it was confirmed, but because it was perfectly unsettling. It fit a narrative of humiliation, of power devoured from within, a cautionary tale disguised as history. And that, perhaps, is what made Edward II's death so bizarre, not just the supposed method, but the theater around it. The fact that his most remembered legacy may be a story too gruesome to prove, too strange to ignore, and too well aligned with the era's darkest imaginations to dismiss entirely. Yet if Edward's end was defined by possible cruelty behind stone walls, the next monarch's final chapter plays out in open daylight, among courtiers and carpets, with madness echoing through palace halls like a song no one can stop humming. Emperor Justin II of the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine emperors were rarely ordinary. They reigned at the center of a 1,000-year experiment in imperial survival, where power was taken as often as it was inherited, where palace intrigues made Shakespeare look tame, and where men ascended the throne only to find their sanity quietly slipping through their fingers. Emperor Justin II, ruling from 565 to 578, didn't so much lose his grip on reality as hurl it from a window, then order his attendants to fetch it back only to forget why he wanted it in the first place. At first glance, Justin was a reasonable choice for emperor. He followed in the footsteps of his uncle, Justinian the Great, whose achievements were cast in marble and law. But Justin II inherited more than just an empire. He inherited its stress, a flailing economy, endless wars, factions pulling at every edge of the crown, not exactly a relaxing post. Early in his reign, he tried to project strength, determination, and self-sufficiency. But slowly, cracks formed. His decisions grew erratic. His paranoia deepened. And then, seemingly without warning, the emperor snapped. The records don't pinpoint a single moment. Madness doesn't always arrive like a lightning bolt. Sometimes it creeps in through the marble corridors and waits quietly by the throne. His behavior spiraled. He was said to bark like a dog. Not metaphorically, literally. He bit his servants, howled in the palace halls, and refused to let music be played because it drove him into fits of rage. When words failed him, he screamed. When his attendants approached, he lashed out. At one point, he insisted on being wheeled through the palace in a mobile throne, pushed around like a tragic toddler emperor, unable to walk or reason or reign. Eventually, the court did what courts tend to do when kings lose their minds. They sidelined him. He was persuaded, possibly coerced into adopting a general, Tiberius, as his heir. Tiberius took over state affairs while Justin was left in his gold-trimmed lunacy, tucked into palace shadows like a dangerous antique no one wanted to throw away. Historians have speculated everything from bipolar disorder to syphilitic dementia, but the truth, as always, is inaccessible. What we know is that a man once groomed for greatness became an imperial ghost in his own rain-haunting banquet halls he no longer recognized, snapping at phantoms only he could see. And still, Justin's death was technically peaceful. He simply stopped breathing one day in 578. No battle, no coup, just silence. The kind of silence that follows madness, not the comforting end of a storm, but the void that waits once the wind runs out. If Justin's death was an eerie glide into darkness, the next king met his end with a banger, rather, a particularly ill-timed bathroom break. Because nothing humbles royalty quite like a porcelain throne. King George II of Great Britain. There are few greater indignities for a monarch than dying on the toilet. Yet, for King George II of Great Britain, the final chapter of his life unfolded not in a gilded ballroom or stately war room, but in the quiet, undignified solitude of a royal lavatory. A king brought low by plumbing. It was 1760, and the monarch who once ruled over Britain during the rise of the Enlightenment, the Jacobite uprisings, and the 7 Years' War met his end in a room no one ever wants their legacy attached to. It began, as so many unfortunate events do, with routine. George II was an early riser. Each morning, he performed his own peculiar regimena, mix of order, repetition, and a dash of hypochondria. That particular morning, he reportedly drank his customary hot chocolate, which in the 18th century was more medicinal than indulgent, and then excused himself to attend to nature. He closed the door. He never came out. Minutes passed. Then servants, perhaps too loyal to knock, finally entered. They found him slumped on the floor, lifeless. He had collapsed mid-strain. The post-mortem diagnosis: an aortic dissection and internal rupture of the main artery, brought on by sudden physical effort. And yes, physical effort in this context means exactly what you think it does. Of course, it's easy to snicker at the mental image a monarch felled in the bathroom, not by bullet or betrayal, but by biology. But beneath the slapstick cruelty lies something oddly poignant. George II, for all his royal might, was still a man made of tissue and blood. The very same blood vessels that had survived battles, court intrigues, and the endless stress of empire finally gave out during the most mundane moment imaginable. The irony? He had outlived many of his political opponents. He was the last British monarch buried at Westminster Abbey. He had weathered storms, rebellions, the complexities of a growing empire. And then silence. Not a violent fall, not a dramatic speech, just an old man collapsing alone in a room tiled and forgettable. And yet, this strange demise somehow suits him. George was never a particularly grandiose figure. He was dutiful, stubborn, emotionally restrained. He left the bold gestures to others, so it makes a certain dark sense that he exited history not with ceremony, but with a thud behind a locked door. But if George's death was defined by silent collapse, the next royal's fate was far more vocal and violently primal. Because when a king is brought down not by empire, but by a monkey, history isn't just cruel. It's actively mocking King Alexander of Greece. When King Alexander of Greece died in 1920, the headlines should have read like this: Young monarch succumbs to wounds sustained during heroic battle for national dignity. But no. Instead, the truth, difficult to embellish, harder to believe, was printed plainly: killed by a monkey bite. At just 27 years old, Alexander had already been through enough to earn a solid chapter in any tragic royal biography. He was never meant to rule. His father, King Constantine I, had been forced into exile during the turbulent years of World War I. Greece, caught between the Allied powers and the Central Powers like a child in a marital dispute, needed a neutral figure, someone who wouldn't offend the international balance. So they picked Alexander, the middle son, as a kind of compromise monarcha figurehead to keep the illusion of monarchy afloat while others pulled the strings. He was, in many ways, a prisoner in a palace, stripped of autonomy, isolated from his family, and surrounded by foreign advisors. Alexander's reign was more symbol than substance. His only rebellion came in the form of love. He secretly married a commoner, Aspasia Manos, in a union that outraged both royalists and republicans. It was one of the only times he acted for himself. The rest of his days were spent wandering the palace gardens, lonely, ceremonial, forgotten. And then came the monkey. The exact details are contested, as they often are when shame and absurdity intertwine. But the broad strokes are known. One day, while walking his dog in the royal gardens at Totoi Palace, Alexander intervened when his pet was attacked by a domesticated monkey. In the scuffle, a second monkey joined the fray. In the confusion, Alexander was bitten not gravely, not heroically, just enough to draw blood. At first, he brushed it off, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of sheer disbelief, but the wound became infected. Septicemia set in. Over the following weeks, the king deteriorated rapidly. Fever, delirium, organ failure. The monarch, who had no real power to begin with, died a slow, undignified death from a wound he never should have had to suffer. The monkey, for what it's worth, survived. Alexander's death sparked a chain reaction. With no clear successor, Greece stumbled back into chaos. His father returned. The monarchy's legitimacy fractured further. One could argue that the bite of a monkey altered the course of modern Greek history, which, again, sounds like satire until it doesn't. And just when it feels like royal deaths can't get any stranger, the next emperor walks in, looking for immortality in a bottle, and finds something much more toxic. Emperor Jiajing of China. Few emperors pursued immortality with the same fervor or desperation as Emperor Jiajing of the Ming Dynasty. Ruling from 1521 to 1567, Jiajing wasn't just a monarch. He was a celestial figurehead, an alchemical experiment, and, in his final act, an unfortunate cautionary tale about the limits of human longevity. His death, when it came, was the culmination of years spent swallowing poison in pursuit of eternal life, a poetic irony that would have been funny if it weren't so utterly tragic. Jiajing was no ordinary emperor. From the moment he took the throne, he seemed less interested in governing and more preoccupied with withdrawing from it entirely. He avoided court audiences. He resided mostly in isolation. And above all else, he was obsessed and utterly consumed by Taoist mysticism and the promise of immortality. In his mind, death was not an inevitability, but a chemical equation. And so he surrounded himself with alchemists, mystics, and spiritual charlatans. Together, they concocted a cocktail of so-called elixirs of life formulas designed to purify the body, extend youth, and ultimately sever the emperor from the chains of mortality. These elixirs, unsurprisingly, were made of mercury, arsenic, lead, and other delightful substances one might now associate more with battery disposal than divine transformation. And Jiajing drank them. Daily, willingly, reverently. The irony was never subtle. As he ingested increasing amounts of these heavy metal brews, his health began to deteriorate. He became erratic, paranoid, deeply reclusive. He believed he was ascending to higher realms, when in fact his kidneys were failing. His skin grew pale, then sallow. His strength waned. Still, he refused to stop. To stop drinking the elixirs would have been to accept mortality, and by then, mortality had become the enemy. By the time of his death in 1567, the emperor was little more than a human crucible, his body, bearing the silent testimony of years of self-inflicted poisoning. The official cause was never listed as death by immortality, but history doesn't need to say it outright. His own obsession wrote the epitaph. There's something painfully human about it. A man at the pinnacle of worldly power, emperor of one of the richest civilizations on earth, who believed, deep down, that all his palaces meant nothing if time could still claim him. That death could still knock on the door, even if it was made of jade and guarded by mystics. And yet, while Jia Jing sought to cheat death and failed, the next king didn't have to try. He was killed by something far simpler, far crueler, and insultingly mundane, a doorway. 7 royals down, and we've already had death by monkey, mercury, and a low doorway. If you're still with us, you clearly have a taste for the bizarre, so hit that subscribe button to keep going down the rabbit hole. And while you're here, let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it as you're listening to history's strangest royal exits? King Charles VIII of France. It takes a certain kind of historical genius to die from walking into a doorway, but King Charles VIII of France, in his relentless rush toward entertainment and perhaps his own undoing, managed to do just that. His life ended not on the battlefield, not in the glow of courtly decadence, but in the shadow of a stone lintelan accident so absurdly ordinary that it feels almost metaphysical. It was April 1498, and Charles was just shy of 30. He had been king since the tender age of 13, inheriting a throne thick with ambition and thin on practical restraint. His reign had been marked by costly military campaigns, most notably in Italy, where he attempted unsuccessfully to revive the glory of Charlemagne by launching a grand invasion of Naples. That mission had drained the French treasury and left his army battered and confused. But Charles? Charles was undeterred. He was young, still energetic, and apparently more interested in games than governance. On the day of his death, he was in Amboise, at his favorite chateau. There was a tennis match scheduled, a relatively new and fashionable game at the time, more courtly display than sport. He was on his way to watch the match, walking briskly through the corridors of the castle, surrounded by his entourage. And then, without warning, he struck his head. A low stone lintel, one he had likely passed 100 times before, caught him squarely in the temple. At first he brushed it off. There was no dramatic collapse, no screams, just a dull thud, a wince, and a continued walk toward the game. But minutes later, he began to feel faint. He collapsed. He was carried to a nearby chamber. And within a few short hours, the King of France, a descendant of Capetians, bearer of divine right, was dead. The cause? Likely a cerebral hemorrhage from blunt force trauma, the kind of injury modern medicine could spot and treat, but in 15th century France, it was simply fate, or divine judgment, or an especially sarcastic accident. And perhaps the most haunting part? His sudden death had vast consequences. With no direct male heir, the throne passed to his cousin, Louis XII, shifting the trajectory of French royal politics entirely. One bump on the head, and the entire arc of a nation veered sideways. Charles's end is a masterclass in cruel understatement. A king dies not in glory, not in infamy, but in a hallway, en route to a tennis game. It reminds us that death doesn't care about titles. And sometimes, all it takes to unmake a crown is the wrong ceiling at the wrong time. But if you think ceilings are treacherous, just wait until the landscape itself gets involved, because the next king was taken out by a tree branch, and a horse, and a river, all at once. King Sigurd seer of Norway. In the rugged, wind-scoured terrain of early medieval Norway, royalty didn't lounge in perfumed courts or die of excessive feasting. No, they rode horses through forests, they hunted. They fought the cold with muscle and myth, and in the case of King Sigurd Syr, they died by sheer, accidental choreography of Nechira. Death so quietly bizarre it feels like a parable disguised as an incident. Sigurd Syr was not the kind of king who demanded attention. He was a petty king, ruling over a modest portion of what would eventually become modern Norway. But what he lacked in grandeur, he made up for in practicality. He was a man of the land, more farmer than warlord, more soil than steel. His nickname, Syr, translates loosely to the Sow, a nod either to his farming habits or his unpretentious demeanor. He was known for being wise, quiet, and deeply uninterested in the kind of brutal politicking that defined so many of his contemporaries. And yet, the gods saw at least the branches shed other plans. The story goes that Sigurd was out riding, as Norse kings often did. Horseback was the king's true throne, the open field his royal court. But one fateful day, as he rode through the forest, something went wrong. A low-hanging tree branch, nothing extraordinary, just another piece of the landscape caught him unawares. It swept him from his horse with the kind of unceremonious efficiency that only nature can deliver. And then, before he could regain his footing or his breath, he tumbled into a nearby river. The water wasn't particularly treacherous, but in heavy clothes, stunned and disoriented, Sigurd drowned. Pulled under not by storm or sabotage, but by a branch, a fall, and a moment too brief to undo. There's a bleak beauty to it. A king so grounded literally and metaphorically meets his end not by human hand, but by the indifferent physics of forest and stream. No assassins, no betrayal. Just gravity, wood, and water conspiring in silence. And it lingers. Because there's something humbling in how absurdly unspectacular it all was. For all the sagas and legends that saturate Norse royal history, Sigurd Syr died in a way that defied drama. A quiet fall, a muffled splash, a man forgotten by the story until history picked up the scene again, decades later, and raised him up not for how he ruled, but for how strangely he vanished. Yet nature's sabotage wasn't done with royalty. Because just a few decades later, another king on another horse would meet his end not by a tree this time, but by a tiny mound of earth. And the smallest animal with the largest impact, King William III of England. It's often said that history turns on small things. A misstep, a glance, a pause too long. But in the case of King William III of England, the fate of a monarch and, arguably, the entire political direction of Britain hinged on something even smaller, a molehill. William III, known also as William of Orange, was no stranger to upheaval. He was thrust into power not by inheritance but by revolution, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, when he and his wife Mary deposed her father, James II, and ushered in a new era of Protestant rule. His reign wasn't about divine right. It was about balance, bureaucracy, and the slow birth of constitutional monarchy. He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't particularly charming. But he was competent, pragmatic, cold as a ledger book. The kind of ruler history respects but doesn't exactly invite to parties. And then came the horse. It was 1702. William was in his early 50s and still riding regularly, a necessity in a time when the best way to project power was to physically appear places. On one ride near Hampton Court, his horse unexpectedly stumbled, a minor thing usually, but the cause? A molehill, that's right. A raised bump of earth, carved by an animal weighing less than half a pound, created just enough of a tilt to send the king tumbling. He hit the ground hard. The fall broke his collarbone again, not a death sentence on its own. But complications arose. Infection, inflammation. Some suggest his already weakened lungs contributed to a rapid decline. Within weeks, he was dead. And just like that, the Protestant monarch who had reshaped the British monarchy was undone by an underground rodent's landscaping. The irony was not lost on his political enemies. Jacobite supporters of the deposed James II gleefully toasted the little gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat, a nickname they gave the mole. Satirical poems circulated. Pamphlets emerged celebrating the mole as the tiny hero who struck down the usurper king. Even in death, William couldn't escape being the symbol of someone else's idea of justice. It's tempting to laugh. A king felled by a molehill sounds like the setup for a joke. But like all royal deaths with a punchline, the implications were far-reaching. His successor, Queen Anne, would oversee the final union of England and Scotland. The shape of Britain itself was altered by the fall of one memento, one patch of dirt. And while William's fall was a literal dethroning by nature, the next king would find no reprieve even in sport. For him, the thrill of the hunt ended not with a trophy, but with a gruesome, tree-born ambush. King Demetrius of Georgia. In the chronicles of royal demise, some monarchs die by betrayal, some by illness, and a few like King Demetrius II of Georgiadi, at the mercy of the natural world mid-performance, in full regalia, with death crashing through the underbrush like a cruel punchline. His fate unfolded not on a battlefield or behind palace walls, but during a hunt, that most aristocratic of Paston-Shaft sport, half ritual, all risk. The year was 1289, and Demetrius was a king seasoned by turmoil. Georgia at the time was a crossroads of cultures, religions, and empires, and Demetrius had spent most of his reign navigating the fine line between independence and submission. He had endured captivity, brokered uneasy alliances, and even married into Mongol royalty as a political maneuver. This wasn't a man unfamiliar with danger. He had faced execution and empire. But what he didn't see coming, what no king ever truly prepares for, was a tree branch with an agenda. It was during one of these royal hunts, deep in the Georgian woods, that the fatal moment occurred. The hunt itself would have been a display of bravado and pageantry, horses galloping through pine-strewn paths, hounds barking, courtiers watching the king with reverence as he rode at full speed. The wind, the chase, the illusion of dominion over nature. But nature, as always, plays its own game. While charging through the forest on horseback, Demetrius was struck by a low-hanging branch. Accounts suggest it caught him squarely in the torso, perhaps the neck pulling him violently from his horse. But falling was only the beginning. The momentum, the speed, the sharp angle of descent conspired against him. He was impaled on another branch as he fell, speared not by an assassin's blade, but by the quiet geometry of trees. There was no battlefield roar, no last words, just the hush of the forest and a sudden absence where a king had been a moment before. It's the kind of death that defies romanticization. There's no nobility in it, just sheer absurdity. The king who had survived Mongol captivity and political exile was unmade by bark and gravity. The woods, indifferent as always, closed back around him. And yet, maybe that's what makes it unforgettable. A king, stripped of armor and intrigue, reminded in his final breath that even sovereigns are vulnerable to what doesn't bow. Not every threat carries a sword. Some threats hang quietly from above, waiting. But if nature's brutality was enough to bring down Demetrius, the next king found that the throne itself designed to elevate can just as easily kill, especially when it decides to fall with you under it. King Bela I of Hungary. It's one thing to die on the throne metaphorically. Plenty of kings have done that, suffering the slow rot of incompetence, or being ousted mid-reign by politics dressed in steel. But King Bela I of Hungary took a more literal route. In 1063, he died beneath his throne. Or, more precisely, because of it. The details are murky in the way all early medieval records are, but the consensus among chroniclers is this: the throne collapsed. During a royal ceremony, perhaps a coronation or a formal audience, Bela sat on his elaborately constructed, symbolically loaded seat, only to have it give way beneath him in catastrophic fashion. The wooden structure, designed to exalt, instead crushed him, or injured him severely enough that he died not long after. Either way, the throne that was meant to support his authority turned traitor. Of course, in a modern context, it sounds like slapstick, a kind of regal furniture malfunction. Cue the absurdist orchestra. But in the 11th century, thrones weren't just chairs, they were divinely sanctioned symbols. They were built with intent, layered with meaning, sometimes literally inscribed with sacred geometry. To have one betray its occupant was not just dangerous, it was ominous. It wasn't a carpentry issue, it was cosmic judgment. Bela I's reign had already been an exercise in instability. He took the throne in 1060 after a civil war against his nephew, Solomon, who had been installed with the support of the German emperor. Bela was, in many ways, the anti-candidate more military commander than court tactician. His rule was short, bruised by dynastic disputes and the constant threat of foreign intervention. He spent more time consolidating legitimacy than enjoying the fruits of kingship. So when the throne collapsed, it wasn't just a physical blow. It read like a divine verdict, a public theatrical reminder that power, no matter how well upholstered, was temporary. Or worse, structurally unsound. Some sources say Bela died immediately. Others claim he lingered, injuries mounting, perhaps grappling with the irony of being undone not by armies or assassins, but by craftsmanship gone rogue. What no one disputes is the symbolism. A king crushed by his own authority. It's hard not to see the poetry in it, however cruel. And speaking of poetry, sometimes it doesn't come in metaphors at all. Sometimes death arrives sharp and sudden, dressed like a man with a knife and a grudge, waiting by the lakeside. Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, had spent most of her life trying to outrun the constraints of empire, corsets, and court etiquette. She was a restless figure romanticized for her beauty, mythologized for her solitude, and imprisoned, always, by the ceremonial machinery of royalty. But even for a woman so famously allergic to attention, her death in 1898 was almost too poetic, unexpected, absurd, and grotesquely casual. She was in Geneva at the time, traveling under a pseudonym. Sisi detested the trappings of public life. She wandered Europe like a ghost in black silk, accompanied by a minimum of staff, often slipping into cities unnoticed. For her, anonymity was the last luxury, a crown without obligation. Her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, still sat on the throne, but Sisi had long since abdicated emotionally. She had lost her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, to suicide years earlier. That grief hollowed her out. She walked 4 hours each day. She fasted obsessively. She lived like someone already halfway gone. The man who killed her, Luigi Luciani, wasn't aiming for her specifically. He was an Italian anarchist, poor, embittered, ideologically overheated. He had hoped to assassinate a member of the nobility would do. When he learned that the Empress of Austria was in town, traveling incognito, he saw his chance. He purchased a simple file sharpened to a point and waited by the lakeside promenade. What followed was so quick it barely registered. As Cece walked arm in arm with her lady-in-waiting, Luchini approached, appeared to stumble, and struck her in the chest with the sharpened tool. She collapsed briefly, then stood up again, confused, seemingly unharmed. She boarded her steamship. It was only once she fainted on board that they opened her bodice and saw the puncture. A single wound, narrow but deep, piercing her heart. She died within the hour. It was a death both intimate and anonymous. No grandeur, no spectacle, just an old file and a gap in security. The Empress, who had spent decades trying to vanish from public life, was finally erased by someone who barely knew who she was. The imperial court responded with outrage, sorrow, ritual. But Cece's death never felt like a political martyrdom. It felt like a personal epilogue, another noble caught in the crossfire of an age shifting violently beneath its own weight. And if a blade in the chest seems abrupt, the next king's end offers something even stranger, death by cannon, self-inflicted not by choice, but by technological ambition gone slightly too bold. King James II of Scotland. The story of King James II of Scotland is, in many ways, a chronicle of explosive ambition both politically and, as fate would cruelly have it, quite literally. Born into a world of Scottish infighting and dynastic paranoia, James's life was always entangled with violence. But even by the standards of 15th century kingship, his death was a uniquely combustible finale. James ascended the throne as a child in 1437, following the brutal assassination of his father, James I. He spent his early years under the tight control of power-hungry regents, nobles who wielded the crown like a puppet's prop. But James grew into his rule with a mixture of youthful fire and calculated vengeance. He developed a reputation for explosive temper and sudden decisions. He murdered the powerful Earl of Douglas in person, stabbing him during a tense dinner trial. No delay, just a monarch losing patience and gaining leverage. So, perhaps it's only fitting that James's death mirrored the volatility of his life. It was 1460, and James was leading a campaign to retake Roxburgh Castle from the English. It was one of those stubborn border fortresses that changed hands like playing cards during the never-ending chess match of Anglo-Scottish hostility. James wanted a decisive blow, something that would both impress his nobles and secure his legacy. He brought with him the latest in siege warfare. Cannons, big ones. Heavy, clunky, terrifying beasts hauled in by oxen and sweat. And then, mid-siege, it happened. One of the cannons, freshly loaded, aimed, and ready to fire, exploded. Accounts differ slightly on the specifics. Some say the king stood too close. Others claim he insisted on lighting the fuse himself. What's certain is that shrapnel from the blast tore through his leg. Possibly more. He died on the spot or shortly after, surrounded by stunned soldiers and stunned silence. The king had essentially blown himself up. There's something tragically operatic about it. A monarch defined by aggression, undone by the very symbols of martial progress he brought to the battlefield. A man who tried to tame his kingdom with steel, only to be killed by his own. Still, the siege continued. Roxburgh was taken. The castle was destroyed, as James had intended. But the victory came at the cost of the king himself, fiery punctuation mark at the end of a reign built on blood and calculation. And from here, we move from fire to fog because the next king wasn't felled by ambition or weapons, but by a horsand, the invisible cliffs that wait in the dark when you ride too fast and rule too hard. King Alexander III of Scotland. There are royal deaths that play out like epics, climactic, bloody, operatic, and then there are those that feel like a slow-motion stumble into oblivion. King Alexander III of Scotland didn't die in war, nor was he cut down by scheming rivals or ambitious generals. He died in the dark, riding alone on a horse that couldn't see the edge of the world until it was too late. It was March of 1286. Alexander, now in his mid-40s, was doing something deeply unwise for a king, traveling by horseback at night in a storm to visit his new queen. A romantic gesture, perhaps, or maybe just royal stubbornness refusing to be slowed down by weather, risk, or the warnings of advisors. After all, he was a seasoned king, popular, effective, and confident. He had spent decades strengthening the Scottish monarchy, securing borders, and overseeing a period of rare stability. Things were going well, which, in history, is always a dangerous moment. On that night, Alexander set out from Edinburgh, determined to cross the treacherous Fife coastline and reach Kinghorn Castle, where Queen Yolande waited. His attendants urged him to delay. The wind howled. The rain lashed down. The roads little more than winding. Unmarked trails over rugged cliffs were treacherous even by daylight. But the king insisted. Power, after all, means never having to listen to good advice. At some point along the route, Alexander became separated from his escort. His horse, blind in the storm and unfamiliar with the path, made a fatal misstep. The king was thrown, or perhaps simply carried off course down a rocky embankment over the edge of a cliff. When his body was found the next morning, he was broken on the shoreline below, alone, no fanfare, no final words, just the sound of waves and the weight of royal arrogance crashing against the rocks. His death set in motion a catastrophe. With no surviving heirshes, children had all died before him. Scotland plunged into a succession crisis. The resulting power vacuum led directly to the wars of Scottish independence. Had he stayed in bed that night, or heeded the storm, history might have unfolded very differently. But fate, as it often does with kings, prefers the melodramatic exit. And so Alexander III became a footnote to his own success story, a king who ruled wisely, died foolishly, and left his nation spiraling toward chaos. But if falling into the sea seems a lonely end, the next emperor's demise plays out in tighter quarters, with whispers of fratricide, a cup too many, and the silent weight of a drinking session that may have rewritten a dynasty. Emperor Taizu of Song. Emperor Taizu of Song didn't die in battle. He wasn't overthrown by rebels, poisoned by rivals, or felled by plague. No, the founder of the Song dynasty, a man who had clawed his way from military commander to emperor, allegedly died after a long night of drinking with his younger brother. Which, in and of itself, is not the strange part. The strange part is that no one really knows what happened after that last cup was poured. It was the year 976. Emperor Taizu, born Zhao Kuang-yin, had ruled for 16 years. He was a man of ambition but not cruelty, known for consolidating fragmented territories into a more unified China. He had fought rebellions, restructured the bureaucracy, and earned the grudging respect of scholars and generals alike. His reign was marked by order and reform. Stability, in imperial terms, is the slow, quiet miracle no one notices until it collapses. Then came the drinking. According to court records vague, nervous, and probably edited the emperor spent the evening in his private chambers with his younger brother, Zhao Kuangyi, who would later ascend the throne as Emperor Taizong. Wine flowed, talk deepened. Perhaps they reminisced, perhaps they argued. The content of their conversation was never recorded, or more likely, it was erased. What followed was a mystery that Chinese historians have chewed on ever since. Taizu was found dead the next morning. No visible wounds, no illness noted beforehand. Just a sudden imperial vacancy, too neat to be natural, too quiet to be clean. The official explanation was that he died peacefully in his sleep, but unofficially, a shadow fell across that night, and it is never fully lifted. Some suggest that Zhao Kuangyi had grown impatient, that the wine was part of a plan, that the cup Taizu drank last was the one that stilled his pulse. Rumors even whisper of a hidden Axia silent strike in the night that ensured a smooth transfer of power. Yet no evidence ever emerged. Nothing but timing, motive, and a suspiciously smooth succession. And so, a man who built an empire by force may have lost his life to a gentle toast and a brother's ambition. His legacy was celebrated, his brother's reign legitimized, and the entire Song dynasty carried on as though nothing had happened. But history remembers. Because in royal courts, sometimes the quietest deaths echo the loudest, and as Taizu's story slips behind the veil of plausible deniability, the next king steps forward mouth full, plate heaped, appetite unchecked. A monarch who, like a tragic sequel, met a strangely familiar end over dinner. Again, King Frederick I of Sweden. By the mid-18th century, King Frederick I of Sweden was less a ruler and more a placeholder. He wore the crown, yes, but the crown wore him thinner every year. His was a reign of passive inertia, a monarch more known for his hobbies gambling, dining, and extramarital affairs than any sweeping reform or military campaign. He didn't shape Sweden. Sweden, in effect, ignored him politely. And in 1751, the man who had lived on the margins of power died on the margins of moderation at the dinner table. Frederick had been king for over 30 years, yet his rule was defined largely by the Age of Liberty, a period during which the Swedish parliament held the real power. He signed the laws, hosted the ceremonies, and accepted the titles, but he rarely wielded the scepter with any genuine control. He was a monarch on paper, ceremonial by design, something between a national uncle and a constitutional antique. So it was fitting, in a bleak sort of way, that his death echoed the life he lived, leisurely, indulgent, and quietly absurd. It happened during yet another heavy meal. Frederick, like his cousin Adolf Frederick, who, as fate would later demonstrate, took overeating to Olympian levels, was known for his love of food. Swedish banquets in the 18th century were not exercises in restraint. The king's table groaned under the weight of herring, reindeer, root vegetables swimming in butter, and multiple rounds of rich, meat-heavy courses. And, of course, alcohol. Always alcohol. As the story goes, Frederick sat down for dinner and never got up. He suffered what was then called apoplexy, a vague, catch-all diagnosis that today we'd likely call a stroke. One moment he was enjoying his meal. The next, he was slumped in his chair, gone before dessert. No last speech, no moment of reflection, just silence broken only by the clink of untouched silverware and the sound of courtiers pretending not to panic. There is no record of what dish did him in, no historical consensus on whether it was gluttony, exhaustion, or simple bad timing. But there's something undeniably theatrical about a king who died at the table, especially one who governed so passively. His greatest political impact may have been choosing not to interfere. In the end, even death arrived, with minimal disruption. And while Frederick's final course was served without drama, the next king's end was pure slapstick carnage, because nothing says royal dignity like dying headfirst in pursuit of a woman, only to be brought down by the ceiling itself. King Louis III of France. In the long catalogue of royal deaths, some are grim, some symbolic, and some, like that of King Louis III of Francier, so absurdly physical that they feel scripted by fate's least mature intern. He didn't die in war or intrigue. He didn't succumb to plague or betrayal. No, Louis III died doing what kings, in theory, should never be seen doing, chasing women through private homes like a hormone, addled adolescent, and then losing a very personal battle with architecture. It was the year 882. Louis III was young, just a teenager, though already crowned king in the fractured tapestry of Carolingian France. He was the son of Louis the Stammerer, a monarch whose name alone suggested a lineage not built for permanence. Still, the boy king tried. His reign, while brief, was not without merit. He had won a rare victory against Viking raiders at the Battle of Saucourt, a skirmish sung in ancient poems as a moment of fleeting French valor. For a flicker, Louis looked like he might grow into his title, but youth has its compulsions. As legend and semi-reliable chroniclers shave it, the young king was staying at a nobleman's home, likely during one of his seasonal tours. These trips were partly ceremonial, partly an excuse to enjoy the hospitality of his feudal underlings. At some point during his stay, Louis became enamored with a local woman, possibly a noble's daughter, possibly a servant. The records get coy when they want to. What they don't dispute is that Louis gave chase literally. The woman fled. He followed on foot, through the halls of the house. And that's when destiny struck him squarely on the forehead. As Louis ran possibly intoxicated, certainly overconfident, failed to notice the low lintel of a doorway. He was tall. The doorway was not. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. His skull cracked. He collapsed. He died not long after, without regaining consciousness. No assassin, no rival, no divine thunderbolt, just one bad measurement, and a king who forgot to duck. There's something starkly poetic in it, a monarch brought down not by politics or war, but by enthusiasm outpacing awareness, a literal case of headstrong youth colliding with the limits of structure, both social and architectural. And as tragicomic as it is, Louis's death offers no sweeping moral. It simply sits in history like a warning label. Power doesn't always protect you from hard surfaces. But while Louis met his end chasing pleasure, the next king would die in a Ragueneau from laughter, love, or leisure, but from the sheer fury boiling in his blood when he heard that his people had taken to throwing others out of windows. King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia. For most monarchs, rage is a performance and expression of authority, a raised voice to remind courtiers who signs the decrees. But King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, true to the melodrama of his lineage, let fury consume him from the inside. And in the end, it wasn't swords, poison, or politics that ended him. It was his own blood boiling, quite literally, at the news that Prague had exploded again into chaos, and this time, by window. It was 1419. Wenceslaus had been king for decades, though you'd be forgiven for not remembering much of what he accomplished. His reign was a long slog of stagnation, religious tension, and internal bickering. As the son of the legendary Charles IV, Wenceslaus inherited shoes too big to fill and a country too unstable to pacify. He spent most of his rule balancing precariously between factions, the Catholic elite on one side, the reformist Hussites on the other, and succeeded mostly in annoying both. He wasn't a tyrant, But neither was he decisive. He drank too much. He sulked through decisions. He was deposed as Holy Roman Emperor, imprisoned by nobles, released again, and wandered back to Prague like a man who couldn't quite remember if he was still in charge or not. Even in his own palace, he was more tolerated than respected. His rule had become a study in exhausted compromise. And then came the window. In the summer of 1419, tensions in Prague boiled over. A mob of angry Hussite demonstrators stormed the new town hall. And there, in a show of righteous anarchy, they grabbed several council members and threw them out the windows. Literally. The first defenestration of Prague. Some of the victims died instantly. Others survived the fall, only to be finished off by the mob below. It was theater, it was message, and it was, perhaps, the most bohemian expression of political disagreement ever conceived. When Wenceslaus heard what had happened, he didn't respond with action. He didn't mobilize troops or summon advisors. He erupted. The king, prone to bouts of emotional instability, flew into a rage so intense that he collapsed. The cause was likely apoplexia, sudden stroke brought on by stress, fury, and decades of pent-up futility. He died shortly afterward, having been overthrown not by his enemies, but by his own circulatory system. No grand finale, no heroic last stand, just an overtaxed heart reacting to the latest in a long line of humiliations. And if that feels oddly internal, the next royal death takes us back outside to the battlefield, where one blind king, defying both age and reason, insisted on riding into combat, tied to two knights, eyes closed, but sword drawn. King John of Bohemia. King John of Bohemia didn't believe in helplessness, not when he was sick, not when he was blind, and certainly not on the eve of one of Europe's most legendary battles. By the time of his death in 1346, John had lost his eyesight, his throne, and most of his influence. But he hadn't lost his pride, which is precisely how he ended up charging headlong into battle, blind, tethered to two other knights like some tragic royal centaur, determined to die with a sword in his hand rather than a physician at his side. John had once been a respected ruler-crowned king of Bohemia in 1310, son-in-law of the Holy Roman Emperor, a man who traveled constantly, fought enthusiastically, and governed. Sporadically. His reign was more kinetic than effective. He seemed allergic to staying in one place, constantly journeying across Europe like a medieval rock star who also dabbled in statecraft. This wandering habit earned him admiration abroad but bred resentment at home. His nobles saw him as distant. His own subjects viewed him as more interested in foreign adventures than domestic stability. By the 1340s, John had gone blind from an eye disease, possibly ophthalmia or cataracts. But if you thought that would slow him down, you'd be mistaken. He simply kept moving, guided by attendants, still attending jousts and wars like a man determined to outpace his own mortality. Retirement was never part of the plan. Then came the Battle of Crécy. England and France were locked in the 100 Years' War. John, still loyal to his French allies, joined King Philip VI's forces to face the invading English army led by Edward III. It was a bloody and decisive battle, and early on it was clear the French were losing. Chaos reigned, commanders fell, lines broke. John, blind and in his 50s, asked his knights to lead him into battle, not metaphorically, but literally. He had them tie his horse to theirs, so they could guide him directly into the fight. And so, with eyes shut by blindness and heart wide open with pride, John rode into the fray. He was, of course, killed, almost instantly slain in the melee, his body found surrounded by his companions. His banner was captured by the English, and in a twist of irony, the victorious Prince of Wales, Edward the Black Prince, was so impressed by John's courage that he adopted his motto, Ich dien, I serve, still used by the Prince of Wales today. John's death wasn't rational. It wasn't strategic. It was stubborn medieval poetry in motion, a final act of defiance against irrelevance. But while John died in deliberate valor, the next monarch died in exile, taken down not by battlefield glory, but by something infinitely smaller and more humiliating, a parrot. King Otto, first of Greece. Some monarchs go out in storms of glory, others in a haze of scandal. But King Otto, the first of Greece? He died in the slow dusk of irrelevance, exiled, ignored, and finally undone by a parrot. Yes, a parrot. A creature more associated with pirates than power struggles, and yet, in the final act of Otto's strange royal life, it may well have played the role of Grim Reaper, feathers and all. Otto wasn't even Greek. He was a Bavarian prince, hand-picked by the great powers of Europe in 1832 to become the first modern king of an independent Greece. It was a diplomatic patch-joba royal band-aid slapped over a new nation born of revolution. Young, Catholic, German, and absolutely foreign in every sense, Otto landed in Athens like a confused tourist asked to run a country. He tried to bring order, build institutions, and govern as best he could. But Greece, fresh out of centuries of Ottoman rule and deeply suspicious of outsiders, didn't take to his rule. He imposed absolutist policies, alienated the Orthodox Church, and stumbled through uprisings with more confusion than clarity. By 1862, the experiment was over. The Greeks had had enough. Otto was deposed in a bloodless coup and sent packing. He boarded a ship back to Bavaria, stripped of his crown, his scepter, and perhaps most painfully, his imagined destiny. But he didn't return to Shame-Not exactly. In Bavaria, he lived as a sort of royal relic, not disgraced, but not exactly celebrated either. Just there, former king of a place he no longer ruled, still dignified, still dressed for the part. And then, in 1867, he reportedly injured his finger after being bitten by his pet parrot, a minor wound, seemingly harmless. But the bite became infected, infection turned to gangrene. Antibiotics, of course, hadn't been invented. And Ottenau, a 52-year-old king without a kingdom, died slowly and absurdly from a tiny laceration delivered by an animal known for mimicking speech. The symbolism couldn't be sharper. A king who had once spoken for a nation lost his voice to a bird that repeated others. A creature that mocked language had inadvertently silenced a monarch. Was the parrot truly the cause? Or was the story simply too perfect to ignore an absurd exclamation point at the end of a reign defined by miscommunication? Either way, Otto's life ended not with a political clash or public uproar, but with a bite and a fever. And if that feels too bizarre to be topped, brace yourself, because the next king's final moment came with a cup in hand, a trusted family member nearby, and a sinister question hanging in the air. Was it a drink or a setup? King Edward, the martyr of England. There's a reason medieval politics reads more like Shakespearean tragedy than dry chronology. It's because nearly every royal death came with shadows, whispers, and the stench of betrayal wafting just beneath the surface. Take King Edward the Martyr. His name alone tells you something went wrong. You don't get labeled the martyr unless someone decides your death deserves sainthood, or at least dramatic framing. And in Edward's case, the framing involves a cup of mead, a family feud, and a stepmother whose hospitality ended with a blade. Edward ascended the English throne in 975, barely a teenager, after the death of his father, King Edgar the Peaceful. But Edward's reign was anything but peaceful. Even before he could warm the throne, factions were forming like storm clouds. Powerful nobles, ambitious bishops, and most importantly, his stepmother Elfthryth all began circling like hawks. Elfthryth wanted the crown for her own son, Ethelred, later known, perhaps unfairly, as the Unready. Edward, being the inconvenient elder son, stood in the way. And in medieval royal logic, the solution to inconvenient heirs was rarely negotiation. Edward wasn't known for tyranny. He didn't rule long enough to earn a legacy. But he had the backing of the church, which meant moral legitimacy, dangerous thing to hand a boy surrounded by people who'd prefer him dethroned. And then, one evening in 978, he rode to visit his stepmother at Corfe Castle. The details from here get suspiciously theatrical. As the story goes, Edward was offered a drink upon arrival, likely a ceremonial gesture, a welcome from Elfthryth herself. But as he drank, he was stabbed. Accounts vary on who delivered the fatal blow. Some say a servant, others Elfthryth's men, or even Elfthryth herself. What's consistent is that Edward fell from his horse, wounded, and was dragged by the stirrup until he died, his young body found battered and lifeless. The murder was quick, the motives were obvious, and the political benefits to Elfthryth and her son were immediate. Edward's death was sanitized by sainthood. He was canonized, buried as a martyr, and remembered more for how he died than anything he ever ruled. Ethelred, meanwhile, took the throne and led England straight into a historical faceplant. Edward's demise is one of those unsettling cases where hospitality becomes homicide. A king accepts a cup from family and pays with his crown and his life. The next monarch, however, wouldn't fall in a castle. He'd fall in flight quite literally at the hands of a common ferryman wielding something far less ceremonial than a royal dagger. King Eric IV of Denmark. Some kings are undone by fate, some by their own flaws. And then there's King Eric IV of Denmark, whose final moments were so humiliatingly unroyal that they read more like the punchline to a grim folktale than a political assassination. This was no battlefield death, no dynastic execution behind silk curtains. This was death by ferryman. Literally, Eric IV, known to history with the slightly misleading title Eric Plowpenny, ruled in the mid-13th century and spent most of his reign trying to impose control over a fragmented kingdom that didn't particularly want it. His nickname came from an unpopular tax he enforced on every plowman, essentially taxing the very act of growing food, never a way to win hearts and minds. Still, he was ambitious, energetic, and determined to centralize royal authority. He just wasn't very good at keeping his brothers from trying to kill him. Denmark at the time was less a unified kingdom and more a chaotic family feud with a coastline. Eric's younger brothers, particularly Abel, Duke of Schleswig, were constantly challenging his rule, demanding more power, more land, and less oversight. Eric responded with a mix of diplomacy and brute force, neither of which resolved much. By 1250, tensions had boiled over. While traveling through his brother Abel's territory under what was allegedly a safe conduct agreement, Eric was captured near the town of Gottorp. The message was clear: family loyalty ends where ambition begins. But what makes the story grotesquely memorable isn't just the betrayal, it's what came next. Eric was handed over to a ferryman, a man named Lave, who had been given explicit instructions. And so, as the story goes, Lave took the King of Denmark out onto the Schlei River. There, in the stillness of the water and the fog of early morning, Eric was decapitated with an axe. No army, no trial. Just a man, a boat, and a royal head rolling into the river like so much excess cargo. His body was thrown into the water and later recovered by monks, but the damage was done both literally and symbolically. The man who tried to unify Denmark was killed by a man who probably didn't even own a second pair of shoes. It was regicide by proxy, farmed out to someone no chronicler could dress up in robes or motives. Just a ferryman with a task, rowing through history with a severed crown in his wake. But if Eric's death was raw and sudden, the next king's demise came not by axe or bloodshed, but by a different form of medieval desperation and aging body, a bottle of mystery potion, and a medical experiment that chased virility and caught death instead, King Ferdinand II of Aragon. By the time King Ferdinand II of Aragon was old, widowed, and slipping into the twilight of his political usefulness, he had already reshaped the world. Alongside his more famous wife, Queen Isabella of Castile, he had unified Spain, sponsored Christopher Columbus, launched the Spanish Inquisition, and presided over the final expulsion of the Moors from Granada. Empires had been born under his watch, and the modern Western world as we know it owes no small debt to his ruthless administrative clarity. But in the end, Ferdinand wasn't looking to expand an empire. He was trying to revive something far more elusive: his libido. After Isabella's death, Ferdinand remarried, this time to a much younger woman, Germaine of Foix, in what can generously be called a strategic union. She was vibrant, of noble French blood, and capable of bearing children. And Ferdinand, already pushing 60, was determined to produce a new male heir to challenge the growing power of his son-in-law, Philip of Habsburg. The only problem? Age, biology, and the cruel arithmetic of mortality. So, like many powerful men with too much ambition and too little time, Ferdinand turned to medicine, specifically to potions. Aphrodisiacs, the 16th century equivalent of snake oil in a goblet. According to several accounts, he began consuming an herbal concoction designed to restore his vigor, a formula whispered by physicians and apothecaries, possibly involving exotic herbs, spices, and if rumor is to be believed, Spanish fly, a notorious medieval stimulant harvested from blister beetles. The results were mixed. The potion didn't restore his virility. It exacerbated his heart problems. He began to suffer sharp pains, swelling, digestive issues, and finally, the slow decline of a body that was already fraying at the edges. He died in 1516, not on the battlefield, not in royal ceremony, but quietly, after what many suspect was a prolonged, potion-assisted organ failure. There's a biting irony in it. Ferdinand, the architect of Catholic Europe, undone by the kind of alchemical optimism he probably would have had banned under the Inquisition. A man who had once commanded fleets and dictated the fate of continents, felled not by politics or protest, but by desperation in a bottle. His death wasn't noble, but it was oddly relatable. A man in decline, reaching for one last grasp at potency, and finding poison instead. But if Ferdinand's ambition collapsed inward, the next king would die while journeying outward far from home, too young, and possibly brought down by something no royal decree could stop: an allergy, a misdiagnosis, or a dose of medicine that cured nothing at all. King Ladislaus III of Hungary. Some royal deaths are written in fire and blood, others disappear into the fog of war, into the battlefield's endless churn. And then there are those like King Ladislaus III of Hungary, so understated, so medically mundane, so wrapped in ambiguity, that the tragedy lies in just how little the world noticed him vanish. His reign was a flicker, his life barely lit before it was extinguished, and the strange whispers around his death, those have only grown louder with time. He was born into the Arpad dynasty, a long line of kings who had ruled Hungary for centuries. His father, King Emeric, died when Ladislaus was still an infant, and in 1204, the crown passed to the boy just 4 years old, a king in name only. The real power fell to his mother, Constance of Aragon, who acted as regent. And unsurprisingly, not everyone was thrilled about that. Enter Andrew, Emeric's younger brother. Ambitious, calculating, and deeply unsatisfied with a child on the throne, Uncle Andrew mounted his own claim. He wanted to rule, and in Hungary, royal blood was often seen more as a tool than a tether. Factions formed, tensions sharpened. And young Ladislaus, meanwhile, was whisked away, his mother fearing for his safety. She fled with him westward, seeking protection in the court of Duke Leopold VI of Austria. It was there, on this quiet diplomatic detour, that Ladislaus died, still only 5 years old. Officially, the cause was illness, something sudden, perhaps a fever or an adverse reaction to medicine. But the specifics remain suspiciously vague. Some later chroniclers claimed he may have died from an allergic reaction to a treatment. Others suspected foul play, a poison tincture, a scheming agent sent by Andrew, or even a deliberate misdiagnosis by someone with more loyalty to Hungarian politics than to a 5-year-old's well-being. No proof ever surfaced. But then again, in a world ruled by shadows and rumor, proof was rarely the point. With Ladislaus gone, Andrew ascended the throne, finally crowned as King Andrew II. The child's brief reign was reduced to a political speed bump hiccup in the royal timeline. And yet, that hiccup changed everything. The succession crisis weakened the monarchy, emboldened the nobility, and helped set the stage for Hungary's gradual decentralization in the decades to follow. Ladislaus III became a tragic footnotia boy who wore a crown but barely lived long enough to see its shape. And as fragile as a child's body may be, the next king's demise flips the absurdity dial yet again, because his final days were wrapped not in medicine or exile, but in rumors of ancient spells, mystical elixirs, and a very royal overconfidence in magical protection. King Sisowath of Cambodia. By the time King Sisowath of Cambodia died in 1927, he had already lived through the long dismantling of royal mystique. Born in 1840, Sisowath had grown up in an era when monarchs still wielded divine power, but by the time he took the throne in 1904, the colonial realities of Southeast Asia had turned kings into cultural artifacts, revered, displayed, but ultimately handled by others. His reign existed in the uneasy space between sovereignty and symbolism, between ancient traditions and the hovering presence of French administrators who spoke softly and carried treaties. But even under colonial watch, Sisowath never quite gave up the old ways. He still believed, as many monarchs of the region did, in the sacred intersection of rule and ritual. In the Cambodian royal court, kings were not just rulers. They were semi-divine conduits between the earthly and the cosmic. Which brings us, inevitably, to his death and the swirling rumors that refuse to let it rest as merely natural causes. The official reports were dry, bureaucratic, and unremarkable. Sisowath, elderly and suffering from fatigue, passed away peacefully in Phnom Penh after a period of declining health. There were no bullets, no revolutions, no scandals that made the international wires, just the slow, quiet failing of a body well past its prime. But off the record outside the colonial dispatches and polite obituaries, the story picks up a more esoteric rhythm. According to palace whispers and preserved anecdotes from attendants, Sisowath had become increasingly dependent on traditional Khmer medicine during his final years. Not merely herbal teas or poultices, but sacred rituals involving spirit invocations, talismans, and the application of protective spells performed by court mystics. One recurring story claimed the king was convinced he could extend his life through an ancient enchantment involving a life-binding ceremony where one's soul was spiritually tethered to a physical object, usually hidden in the palace grounds. His health did not improve, but the rituals continued. In fact, some say Sisowath refused Western medical advice near the end, believing it would disrupt the delicate balance of his spiritual protections. Whether that resistance accelerated his death or was simply part of the slow unraveling is unclear. But the contrast is striking. A monarch caught between the sterile logic of colonial medicine and the mystical assurances of centuries-old traditions. Sisowath's death, in the end, remains officially mundane, but wrapped in just enough smoke and folklore to make you wonder if something older and stranger was at play. And if sacred fire failed to protect one king, the next would fall to literal fire kindled not by magic or rebellion, but by the silent flicker of a hearth ember and a robe too fine to survive it. King Stanisław Leszczyński of Poland. Some royal deaths whisper, others roar. But the death of King Stanisław Leszczyński arrives with a hiss the sound of silk meeting flame. Not the grand finale one might expect for a man who had twice been king of Poland, once been exiled, and lived to an age where most monarchs were long buried or rewritten. In a way, his death was a cruel epilogue to a life spent constantly trying and mostly failing to sit comfortably on the throne. Stanisław was the political equivalent of a gentle wind in a hurricane. He was installed as King of Poland in 1704, not because of overwhelming popular support or military might, but because he was convenient. Sweden's King Charles XII propped him up as a puppet during the Great Northern War, and when the Swedish tide turned, so too did Stanisław's fortune. He was ousted, exiled, and then somehow returned again decades later, only to be ousted a second time. But exile didn't destroy him, it merely redirected him. He ended up in France where his daughter, Maria Leszczyńska, married King Louis XV. Through that marriage, Stanisław became the king who lost everything but gained immortality in lace-trimmed French salons. He was given the Duchy of Lorraine as a consolation prize and spent his final decades in respectable semi-retirement at the Château de Luneville. There, he became a patron of the arts, a philosopher king without a kingdom, scribbling treatises and correspondence while history moved briskly past him. And then, in 1766, death arrived, not with swords or political knives, but with fires more domestic and merciless. One evening, while sitting near the hearth, Stanisław's silk dressing gown caught an ember. The fabric, luxurious and highly flammable, ignited almost instantly. Servants rushed in, but not fast enough. The fire seared his legs and lower body, causing extensive burns. He survived the initial incident but lingered in agony for several days, succumbing not long after to infection or complications depending on which diplomat's diary you believe. It was a mundane, horrifying accident. A monarch undone not by war or political miscalculation, but by the friction between luxury and fragility. Silk was a status symbol opulent, noble, and absolutely useless in a fight against flame. And that's what makes his death so haunting. After decades of instability, exile, and geopolitical chess, it wasn't ambition or treachery that finally took him, it was comfort. A king at rest, destroyed by the very trappings of peace. But while Stanisław perished quietly, consumed by heat and time, the next royal would be undone by the slow fire within an emperor rotting in public view, swallowed by his own body while the court watched and feasted. King Philip II of Spain. King Philip II of Spain didn't die with a scream. He died with a smell. slowly, relentlessly, and so publicly that it became almost ceremonial, an emperor decomposing in real time, while the empire he'd built with iron and inquisitors sat quietly watching. His death in 1598 was the culmination of decades of bureaucratic brilliance and theological obsession, all funneled into a body that refused to give him the dignity of a quiet exit. Philip II ruled one of the largest empires in history. Spain, under his command, became a global juggernaut. Gold flowed in from the New World, the Armada was launched and famously wrecked, and the machinery of empire was codified in forms, files, and endless paper. Philip was, if nothing else, an administrator of suffocating discipline. He rarely left his dark study at El Escorial. His idea of governance was a room of locked drawers and letters sorted by category. For him, power was paperwork. But as he aged, his body rebelled. Philip's health, always fragile, deteriorated catastrophically in the final years of his life. He was afflicted by gout so severe that he could no longer walk. His legs swelled and split. Bed sores opened and refused to heal. Some reports say his bones became visible. He was confined to a bed in a dark, incense-thickened chamber at El Escorial, surrounded by crucifixes, bleeding saints, and piles of religious texts, all while the smell of rotting flesh slowly overtook the scent of piety. And yet, despite the pain, he refused to stop ruling. He insisted on reading reports, signing decrees, dictating responses. His fingers curled and cramped. His eyes failed. His ministers whispered in doorways, but Philip clung to power with the same grim force that had built his empire, through sheer, suffocating control. Visitors to his death chamber left with haunted expressions. Diplomats and priests alike noted the grotesque state of the king's body, and still he lasted. Week after week, enduring what many believed was divine punishment for his excesses, the executions, the heresy trials, the wars fought in God's name and the king's interest. His death was not fast. It was a long, rotting metaphor. And when it finally ended, Spain exhaled. But empires do not fall in one breath, nor do kings always die slow. The next ruler's fate was sudden, sharp, and unsettling, because in his palace, loyalty meant nothing, and death came not from disease or battle, but a eunuch with a blade and a vendetta soaked in palace incense. King Gongmin of Goryeo. Power is never safe, least of all in a palace. Behind every jeweled screen and ceremonial robe is a man walking a razor's edge, no matter how many servants bow or how many portraits are painted. And King Gongmin of Goryeo understood that better than most. He lived in a court that whispered, shifted, and cut. A place where your own reflection might one day betray you. His death, when it came in 1374, wasn't simply murder, it was theater. The kind staged behind closed doors, written in blood, and directed by fear. Gongmin ascended the throne of Goryeo, Korean kingdom, tangled between independence and Mongol domination in a time of fragile identity. At first, he ruled under the influence of the Yuan dynasty. His early years were watched carefully, his movements echoing imperial expectation. But when the Mongols began to weaken, Gongmin changed. He purged collaborators. He launched land reforms. He tried to untangle centuries of foreign entanglement and bring sovereignty back to the throne. But reform in a kingdom built on favors and feudal debts is never clean. For every policy he tried to push, someone with a dagger grew restless. And then there was his personal life. Gongmin was a man of contradictions, deeply spiritual, erratically impulsive. After the death of his beloved queen, his grief turned into obsession. He surrounded himself not with nobles or scholars, but with young monks, artists, and palace boys. He designed temples, painted religious art, and increasingly withdrew from courtly governance into personal pleasures and mysticism. To many in his government, he seemed to be slipping not into madness, perhaps, but into something dangerously unpredictable. So the plot was hatched. On a quiet night in the royal palace, a eunuch named Hong Ryun, along with several disgruntled courtiers, entered Gongmin's chambers. He was unguarded physically, emotionally, politically. The men moved quickly. He was stabbed, repeatedly, in the heart of the palace he had ruled, in the bed where he had once dreamed of sovereignty. There was no trial, no warning, no show, just silence, followed by screams, followed by silence again. The court announced his death as a regrettable incident, a tragedy, an unfortunate accident of palace discontent, but no one believed the wording. Everyone knew Gongmin had ruled too long on his own terms. In a court obsessed with order, unpredictability is fatal. And so ends the story of a king undone not by foreign invasion or rebellion, but by his own palace, his own people, his own walls. But if murder in silk robes is unsettling, the next royal demise offers a different twist entirely. Imagine being blind, on a horse, in a forest, with a rifle. What could possibly go wrong? King George V of Hanover. There's something almost mythic about a blind king on horseback. It evokes a sort of tragic majesty, the image of a ruler who can no longer see the world, yet insists on riding through it anyway, guided by memory, pride, and the illusion of control. But myth has no mercy. And for King George V of Hanover, that image ended not in legend, but in a brutal thud during a hunt in 1878. It was the kind of death that belonged in a cautionary tale, somewhere between a fable and a facepalm. George V of Hanover was born into royal complexity. The only son of King Ernest Augustus, he inherited both the crown and a streak of obstinate conservatism that made him notoriously resistant to modern liberalism. He was a cousin of Queen Victoria, but ideological oceans stretched between them. He ruled the small German kingdom of Hanover at a time when Prussia was swallowing up everything in sight, consolidating power under Otto von Bismarck's iron grip. George stood firm, refused to bow, and lost his throne in 1866 after siding with Austria in a war he probably should have avoided. Exiled to Austria, George became a king in name only, a royal ghost, floating through European courts with titles no longer backed by territory. But if political vision had failed him, so had his physical one. He'd been blind since age 14, the result of a childhood illness. That hadn't stopped him from learning to navigate the world. He read Braille, spoke several languages, managed court affairs, and crucially never gave up horseback riding. Because apparently, being blind was not enough to convince him that galloping through the woods with a firearm might be unwise. The hunt was intended to be routine, ceremonial even, a small gathering, a reminder that royal blood still pulsed through his exiled veins. George mounted his horse. He rode into the forest. And at some point, the ride stopped being symbolic and became fatal. Accounts suggest he fell. Perhaps the horse stumbled, or maybe he misjudged a turn. The impact was severe. Some say he struck a tree. Others suggest the rifle discharged in the confusion. Regardless, the injuries were catastrophic. He died not long after. There was no crown, no kingdom, just a blind former king, determined to keep performing monarchy until nature itself rejected the charade. But if George's death was defined by isolation and pride, the next king would find no solitude in his unjust ambush, desecration, and the brutal display of royal flesh turned into warning. King Llewellyn ap Gruffydd of Wales. In the long and blood-soaked story of English conquest, few moments feel as personal or as grimly theatrical as the death of King Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the last sovereign Prince of Wales. He didn't die in a throne room. He didn't die in open battle. He died in a forest ambush, far from ceremony, struck down without dignity, and then perhaps most bizarrely his severed head was sent on a royal roadshow. It's not every day a king becomes a cautionary centerpiece on a pole. Llywelyn, known to some as Llywelyn the Last, ruled in a time when Wales was not yet a memory, but a nation constantly at war with itself and with England. He spent his reign trying to unite the fractious Welsh lords under one banner, while simultaneously resisting the expanding grip of Edward I of Englanda, king whose architectural passion for castles was rivaled only by his appetite for domination. Llywelyn pushed back as best he could. He made treaties. He broke them. He married politically. He maneuvered with caution, always half expecting the axe to fall. It did. In December of 1282, Llywelyn rode into mid-Wales under the impression he was meeting allies. What happened instead was swift and treacherous. Somewhere near the village of Silmeri, he was ambushed by English soldiers. Accounts vary, some say he was lured, others that he simply stumbled into a well-laid trap. Either way, he was separated from his guard, struck down, and most importantly, unrecognized. Yes, the man who had ruled all of Wales was killed without his captors realizing who he was. It was only after they searched the body that they discovered his identity, at which point things got ceremonial in the most grotesque sense. His head was cut off and sent to Edward I as a prize. The English king, never one to waste an opportunity for symbolic theatre, had it displayed on a spike at the Tower of London, adorned with a mock crown of ivy. A cruel, leafy jab at Welsh pretensions of royalty. It was the end not just of Llywelyn, but of independent Wales as a political entity. What followed was occupation, suppression, and centuries of enforced silence. But that final act off, a king reduced to a roadside attraction, is what lingers. It wasn't just execution, it was humiliation as statecraft. Yet even desecration has its limits. Because the next king's death didn't involve enemies or betrayal, it was self-inflicted in a way, born from stubbornness, gluttony, and a fatal refusal to ignore the warnings of his doctor about fish. King Henry I of England. Kings rarely take medical advice well, and in the case of King Henry I of England, it wasn't politics or treachery that killed him, but dinner. Specifically, an eel dinner. Even more specifically, a dish he had been told not to eat, repeatedly, by his own physician. But kings, especially those who have survived countless uprisings, betrayals, and endless Plantagenet family drama, do not enjoy being told what they can or cannot chew. And so Henry chewed anyway. And then he died. It was 1135. Henry I was in his 60s, a decent age for a medieval monarch, and still active, even restless. His court was in Normandy, where he was dealing with the usual royal headaches, land disputes, succession problems, and the general unruliness of the Anglo-Norman barons. His only legitimate son and heir, William, had died years earlier in the White Ship disaster, a maritime tragedy so catastrophic it nearly wiped out the English nobility in one icy gulp. Ever since, Henry had been trying to secure the throne for his daughter Matilda, to the outrage of every noble who couldn't imagine kneeling to a woman. Tensions were rising. A crisis was brewing. But Henry had more pressing concerns, like lunch. He was offered a dish of lamprey seal-like, jawless fish that were considered a delicacy in medieval Europe. Slimy, ugly, and notoriously hard to digest, they were not kind to the stomach. Henry's doctors had warned him for years that lampreys didn't sit well with him. But that night, perhaps out of boredom or defiance or the fatal sin of craving, he indulged in what chroniclers would later call a surfeit of lampreys. Shortly after, he fell ill. The symptoms were violent: nausea, fever, weakness, intestinal agony. Over the next few days, his condition worsened. He was bled a medieval cure-all that more often resembled a slow assassination, and finally, he died. All because he couldn't say no to a fish. His death triggered a succession crisis that led to a full-blown civil war known politely as the Anarchy, which tore England apart for nearly 2 decades. All because one king ignored his diet and overestimated his stomach's loyalty. There's something almost profound about it. A king who ruled through order, who was obsessed with record-keeping and governance, undone not by chaos but by appetite, not by sword but supper. And if Henry's death was a cautionary tale about indulgence, the next emperor's demise would echo with similar ironics, except this time, the so-called cure wasn't a meal, but a myth. A glowing promise of immortality brewed in a cauldron of mercury. Emperor Wuzong of Tang. In the great scroll of Chinese emperors, Emperor Wuzong of the Tang dynasty occupies an odd corner, part warrior, part fanatic, part cautionary tale. His reign in the mid-9th century was brief but incendiary. He ruled with a furious energy, launching brutal purges against Buddhism, Taoism, and any spiritual movement he didn't personally sanction. Yet, for all his ideological fervor, Wuzong's most enduring legacy may be the strange, glittering vial he clutched toward the end, an alchemical elixir that promised him immortality and gave him something far more immediate: death. Wuzong came to power in 840 CE. The Tang dynasty was already deep into its imperial middle age, powerful, decadent, and increasingly unstable. Wuzong arrived like a dose of pure caffeine. He championed Confucianism, slashed court excesses, and declared war on what he saw as moral corruption, especially Buddhism, which had grown wealthy and widespread. Temples were destroyed. Monks were defrocked. Sacred texts were burned. He framed it as purification. His enemies called it lunacy. Either way, the emperor was on a mission to reshape the spiritual soul of China. But beneath the political zeal burned a deeper anxiety death. Wuzong, like many emperors before him, grew increasingly obsessed with Taoist immortality. Not metaphorical immortality. Not a legacy he wanted to live forever. His court alchemists, eager to please or perhaps just well-practiced in poisoning royalty, offered him a solution: the legendary elixir of life. These elixirs were alchemical brews, typically containing realgar, arsenic sulfide, cinnabar, mercury sulfide, and other substances that shimmered with mystery and toxicity in equal measure. They were believed to harmonize the elements of the body, to transform flesh into eternal substance. Wuzong began taking them regularly. At first, he may have felt revitalized. Such poisons can cause euphoric effects in small doses. But the decline came fast. His body began to break down internally, invisibly, irreversibly. His mind followed. His behavior turned erratic. His speech confused. His court, once terrified of his energy, now watched helplessly as he disintegrated from the inside out. In 846, after just 6 years on the throne, Wuzong died, his internal organs ruined, his blood likely saturated with heavy metals, and his body collapsing under the weight of his own ambition. He wanted eternity. He got 6 years and a cautionary legacy. And while Wuzong perished trying to escape the furnace of time, The next king would die trying to escape something far more banal, a heat source he could have walked away from. If only protocol didn't require someone else to move his chair. King Philip III of Spain. There's an old saying about monarchs dying because no one dared to tell them no. In the case of King Philip III of Spain, the truth is even darker. He didn't die because of bad policy or political betrayal. He died because the man responsible for moving his chair wasn't in the room. That's it. That's the punchline. A royal corpse brought about not by rebellion or divine retribution, but by bureaucracy. Philip III wasn't exactly a monarch known for his vitality. He ruled from 1598 to 1621, inheriting the immense Spanish Empire at its absolute zenith, golden galleons crossing oceans, colonies stretching over continents, and the church laced through every level of governance. But Philip wasn't his father, the meticulous and terrifying Philip II. He lacked his father's obsessive attention to detail and instead handed the business of ruling over to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma. Delegation in itself wasn't the problem. It was Philip's sheer passivity. He became a king in name only, a pious, indecisive, ceremony-bound figure who preferred prayer to governance and silence to decision-making. So perhaps it's no surprise that he died in a way that perfectly reflected the hollow machinery of his court. One winter, as was customary, a brazier and open charcoal heater was placed in his chamber to provide warmth. Unfortunately, it was placed too close to the king. Far too close. The fire blazed hotter than expected, and soon the room filled with oppressive heat. Philip began to sweat. He grew faint. But instead of moving away from the source of discomfort, a gesture anyone else would perform, without thinking, he remained seated. Why? Because only a specific court official had the authority to move the royal chair, and that man was not present. No servant, no guard, no noble dared violate protocol by adjusting the king's position. So Philip sat, suffering, while his body absorbed the oppressive heat. He soon developed a fever, possibly heat stroke, or a respiratory infection, and his health deteriorated rapidly. Within days, the King of Spain, ruler of one of the largest empires in the world, was dead. He was undone not by enemies or time, but by procedure. By a system so obsessed with hierarchy that it let its monarch bake in his own title. And while Philip's death was tragically absurd in its bureaucratic rigidity, the next king's demise would return us to the familiar murk of hunting accident, except this time, the fatal arrow may have come from a trusted hand, or a not-so-trustworthy one. King William Rufus of England. Few royal deaths are so perfectly staged for suspicion as that of King William II of England, better known as William Rufus. He died in 1100, in the middle of a forest, shot through the chest with an arrow during a hunting expedition. The official story is that it was an accident, a simple misfire. But the details are too convenient, the timing too suspicious, and the witnesses far too silent. In truth, William's death looks less like a tragedy and more like a cover-up, performed with the efficiency of a well-aimed bowstring. William Rufus was never beloved. The son of William the Conqueror, he inherited the English crown while his older brother Robert took Normandy. William was loud, aggressive, cynical, a man more feared than admired. He was openly dismissive of the church, heavily taxing both nobles and clergy, and filling his court with flatterers and mercenaries. Chroniclers, mostly monks with long memories and sharper quills than swords, painted him as immoral, irreverent, and overly fond of cruelty. Whether or not he deserved the reputation, it lingered. So when he entered the New Forest on the 2nd of August, 1100, for a routine hunt, It's fair to say that not everyone would have been devastated if he didn't come back out. He rode with a small party, including one man of particular interest, Walter Tyrrell, a nobleman with no shortage of ambition and a sharp aim. At some point during the hunt, an arrow was loosed. It struck William in the chest, deep, fatal, instant. The others claimed Tyrrell had fired the shot unintentionally while aiming at a stag. Tyrrell, curiously, fled the scene immediately. He didn't return to offer explanation or grief. He didn't even pause to help the king. He mounted his horse and rode out of the forest like a man who'd suddenly remembered an urgent appointment far, far away. Even stranger, William's body was left where it fell. No royal escort, no honor guard, just a common charcoal burner who happened upon the corpse and hauled it to Winchester slung across a cart. England's king entered history not with a crown, but with flies buzzing around an arrow wound. His younger brother Henry, who happened to be part of the hunting party, wasted no time. He dashed to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and declared himself king within days. Accident? Perhaps, but in this forest, the trees seemed to whisper something else entirely. And if William's end felt like a tale told in shadows, the next king's death would come under the foreign sun of crusade where illness, pride, and distance from home proved more fatal than any enemy blade. King Conrad III of Germany. In the grand tradition of monarchs venturing eastward to chase glory, King Conrad III of Germany did not die with a sword in his hand or on the steps of a besieged city. Number he died on the way back. Not with fanfare, but with fever. Not in battle, but in bed. His death wasn't even in his own country, but somewhere between purpose and regret a royal expiration in the borderlands of ambition. Conrad III reigned during a time when kings were less administrators and more walking symbols of divine will wrapped in chainmail. As the first king of Germany from the Hohenstaufen dynasty, he inherited both the title and the expectations that came with it. And those expectations included one particularly dangerous obligation: the Crusades. In 1147, Conrad answered the call of the Second Crusade, a campaign blessed by the Pope and cursed by geography, bad logistics, and worse leadership. He marched east with his armies, full of zeal and baggage. The goal was Jerusalem, or maybe Edessa depending on which map and which miracle you believed in, but what he found was disaster. The German contingent was poorly supplied and quickly decimated by the terrain, starvation, and ambushes in Anatolia. By the time they limped into Byzantine territory, most of the army had been reduced to footnotes and blisters. The crusade itself was a failure, marred by infighting and strategic confusion. Conrad returned home not with relics or divine favor, but with dysentery and disillusionment. And somewhere along that long, humbling journey, back far from palaces, far from the clean comfort of ceremony, contracted malaria, or something close enough. The records, as always, are politely vague. They simply note that the king fell ill and never recovered. He died in 1152, not surrounded by glory, but by exhaustion. The way you do when your body simply gives out under the accumulated weight of dust, bad water, and failed holy war. There was no final proclamation, no poetic last stand, just fever, decline, and the quiet realization that crusading kings often met their ends far from where they thought they would. His son didn't inherit the throne. The crown passed sideways, then downward. The dynasty would rise again, but without him. If Conrad's death reminds us that empires can't be ruled from a sickbed, the next king's end is even more abrupt. Imagine a bridge, a fall, and a royal body lost to the water because sometimes history gives even its founding fathers a final, ironic plunge. King Mieszko I of Poland. For a man often credited as the founder of Poland, King Mieszko I received a death so strangely anticlimactic that even the chroniclers seemed to shrug mid-sentence. This was not a man dragged down by assassins or suffocated by court conspiracies. His death came, quite simply, with a fall, possibly from a bridge, possibly after a stroke, possibly both. And while historians argue about which detail is more likely, the real mystery is how the death of such a foundational figure managed to slip so quietly through the cracks. Mieszko ruled in the 10th century, a time when kingship was more muscle than institution. His reign was defined not by paperwork, but by battlefield consolidation, strategic marriages, and the delicate balancing act of embracing Christianity just enough to keep the Holy Roman Empire from turning Poland into a client state. In 966, he officially converted to Christianity, part spiritual awakening, part calculated diplomatic maneuver. That moment became the symbolic birth of the Polish state. One king, one baptism, one nation, or at least that's how the myth was later polished. In reality, Mieszko was a pragmatic warlord in royal clothing. He subdued rival tribes, brokered power with German emperors, and carved out an identity for Poland with equal parts faith and force. He outlived enemies, outwitted rivals. His reign, though not always stable, was indisputably transformative. And then he fell. According to some sources, Mieszko died in 992 after suffering a sudden stroke that caused him to lose balance and fall from a bridge. Whether the fall caused the stroke or the stroke caused the fall depends on which monk's scribbled notes you prefer. Either way, he ended up dead and wet and probably quite surprised. No glorious deathbed speech. No final campaign, just a sudden exit stage left, into the river. Some later historians prefer to gloss over the fall entirely, labeling his death as natural. Others lean into the symbolism how a man who built a kingdom through crossing borders and forging links between fractured lands might have, in the end, fallen through the very gaps he spent his life trying to bridge. A founder swallowed by the space between steps. Still, there's something poetic in the anticlimax. Mieszko, the unifier, not killed by sword or subterfuge, but by gravity and misfortune. And if he slipped through history with quiet irony, the next king went out surrounded by decadence succumbing not to fate or accident, but to a feast that grew far too rich, and a body that grew far too tired of pretending it could keep up. King Casimir IV, Jagiellon of Poland. If a king's death can ever be described as indulgent, King Casimir IV, Jagiellon of Poland, provides a textbook if bloated example. His demise in 1492 wasn't dramatic, or mysterious, or even particularly memorable at the time. It was, rather plainly, the slow unraveling of a man who'd simply enjoyed too much of everything for too long. Food, mostly, and possibly drink. Though the records stop just short of calling him a glutton, they certainly don't paint the portrait of a man who believed in restraint. Casimir IV ruled Poland and Lithuania for nearly 5 decades, a staggeringly long reign in a century where most monarchs died from either warfare or family. He was strategic, effective, and lucky marrying into power, surviving the plague, and somehow keeping a sprawling multi-ethnic commonwealth together through diplomacy, military maneuvering, and the occasional stern silence. He fathered 13 children, several of whom went on to become kings and cardinals in their own right, turning the Jagiellon dynasty into a pan-European brand. But the weight of empire, it turns out, wasn't the only burden he carried. As he aged, Casimir became increasingly sedentary, increasingly indulgent, and if whispers are to be believed, dangerously fond of the royal pantry. Chroniclers note that his health declined, suddenly. But the reality was likely less sudden and more cumulative. Years of banquets, heavy meats, rich sauces, and sweet wines had caught up with him. Gout was common among kings, but in Casimir's case, it may have been the least of his problems. There are references to severe stomach ailments, possible heart complications, and episodes of physical collapse in his final years. He died in the royal palace at Grodno technically from illness, but spiritually from excess. His body, reportedly bloated and in poor condition, became something of a medical curiosity at the time. He was interred in Wawel Cathedral, surrounded by saints and stone, a regal sleep sealed with all the dignity that eluded his final days. And yet, his death was a kind of quiet metaphor. A king who had spent a lifetime building power, consolidating territory, securing dynasties undone not by enemies, but by appetite. The empire stood firm, but the man at its center simply wore out. If Casimir's end was slow and syrupy, the next king's death would be violently fast, this body ravaged not by time, but by dysentery, the medieval equalizer that cared nothing for crowns or legacy, only for speed. King Louis VI of France. If kings were measured by how they died rather than how they ruled, King Louis VI of France might be remembered less as Louis the Fat and more as Louis the Very Unfortunate. In 1137, after a reign filled with military skirmishes, clerical reforms, and an ongoing battle with his own waistline, Louis met his end not on the battlefield or in the royal bedchamber, but in the latrines of human biology, dragged down by dysentery, the great equalizer of all things royal and not. Louis VI was, as his epithet suggests, not a man of dainty proportions. Even in his younger years, he was broad and imposing, with a body that only grew more ambitious as time went on. His weight was a subject of court gossip, foreign commentary, and, eventually, tactical concern. Some accounts claim he became so large that he could no longer mount a horse without a sistancer, possibly without a pulley system. Still, for all his physical heaviness, Louis was no slouch politically. He clawed back power from rebellious nobles, strengthened the crown's hold on the Parisian heartland, and began centralizing what would later become the core of modern France. But in his later years, his health took a sharp turn. Dysentery, essentially an internal revolt of the bowels, was a common visitor in medieval courts. Filthy water, rotting food, and poor hygiene turned even the cleanest-looking chalice into a potential death sentence. For Louis, already burdened with obesity, age, and stress, the infection proved too much. He developed severe symptoms: violent diarrhea, dehydration, fever, and a weakening that no tincture or monk's prayer could slow. By the time the illness had fully taken hold, the king was a shadow of his former self, trapped in his own body, rapidly deteriorating, as the court watched in a mixture of horror and helplessness. Even the best physicians of the day, armed with leeches, herbal infusions, and endless self-assurance, could do nothing. Louis died in a state of physical collapse, in a body that could no longer support the crown it once carried. And yet, as with so many royal deaths, his was more than personal. His passing marked the end of an era. His son, Louis VII, would inherit the throne and later marry Eleanor of Aquitaine, launching a saga that would eventually lead to the rise of the Angevin Empire and one of history's most dysfunctional royal marriages. But if Louis VI died by natural disintegration, the next monarch's fall would be anything but organic, cut down not in secret, but in sanctuary, his blood soaking the stones of a church floor meant to protect him, King Canute IV of Denmark. In an age when kings ruled by divine right, it was widely believed that the church was a sanctuary, even for the guilty, so surely it would protect a king. But King Canute IV of Denmark learned otherwise. He died not by treachery in the court or betrayal in the field, but by a mob in a church, not assassinated in secret, but struck down in sacred space while praying at the altar. For a man later canonized as a saint, his death was not a holy exit. It was an uprising that started with taxes and ended with blood in the nave. Canute IV ruled from 1080 until his abrupt and brutal death in 1086. Unlike many kings of his era, Canute had a vision known that involved strengthening royal authority, centralizing power, and enforcing the kind of national order that the Danish nobility and peasantry were not particularly enthusiastic about. He was deeply pious, fiercely ambitious, and, by all accounts, entirely unwilling to bend to anyone not named God. He taxed the land. He pushed military reforms. He tried to revive an older, stronger version of kingship rooted in divine legitimacy. It did not go well. In 1085, Canute called for a massive invasion of England, hoping to reclaim lands once ruled by his uncle, King Canute the Great. He levied ships, gathered men, and raised funds aggressively. Then he delayed. The invasion never came, but the taxes and forced obligations remained. Tensions flared across Denmark. Nobles grew restless. Farmers grew furious. And Canute, instead of softening, doubled down, punishing dissent, seizing property, and demanding unwavering loyalty. By the summer of 1086, the pot boiled over. An armed rebellion rose in Jutland. Canute fled with a small retinue to the church of St. Alban in Odense, seeking refuge within the walls of the sacred. But the mob was not interested in ecclesiastical boundaries. They stormed the church, dragging anger and axes past the pews. As Canute knelt at the altar, they struck him down along with his brother and several attendants. The sanctity of the space meant nothing. His cries, if he made any, were swallowed by centuries of silence. Ironically, his death granted him what life did not. He was soon canonized by the Church for his piety and martyrdom, becoming Denmark's first royal saint. But sainthood came only after his authority was obliterated by the very people he claimed to lead. And if Canute's sanctuary turned to slaughter, the next king's fate would be even more humbling, trampled by his own horse, his royal plans crushed beneath the same hooves meant to carry him to glory. King Alfonso VIII of Castile. Royal death doesn't always come wrapped in conspiracy or cloaked in battlefield mist. Sometimes it comes galloping down a familiar path, hooves thundering, reins snapping until something goes wrong, very wrong. For King Alfonso VIII of Castile, conqueror of Moorish strongholds and patron of one of medieval Spain's bloodiest victories, death didn't arrive by blade or betrayal. It arrived on 4 legs, a horse. His horse, the very symbol of mobility, command, and nobility, and it turned against him in an instant. Alfonso VIII ruled for over 50 years, a staggering reign by medieval standards, and is best remembered for his pivotal role in the Reconquista. His defining moment came in 12, when he led a coalition of Christian forces to victory against the Almohads at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. That battle didn't just win territory. It shifted the balance of power in the Iberian Peninsula, carving the map with a sword and baptizing it with blood. Alfonso was hailed as a hero, a divine instrument of Christian resurgence. But history has a long memory and a very dry sense of humor. A few years after his greatest triumph, the king's health began to decline. The pressures of rule, age, and ceaseless campaigning had worn him thin, but Alfonso wasn't one to be idle. He continued traveling across his territories, managing disputes and keeping the nobles just nervous enough to stay in line. And on one of these trips, fate mounted the saddle beside him. The story goes that Alfonso, in poor health but stubborn as ever, insisted on riding. Whether the terrain was rough or the horse startled or his body simply gave out, no one can say for certain. But at some point during the ride, he fell hard, and the horse, panicked, confused, untrained for royal crisis management, either landed on him or trampled him in the chaos. The injuries were immediate and severe: crushed ribs, internal bleeding, fractures. In an age without surgery or even a basic understanding of trauma care, there was little anyone could do. He was taken to rest, and he died shortly afterward, brought down not by an assassin or enemy general, but by gravity and a misstep. It's a death that feels almost offensive in its simplicity. A king who outwitted warlords and united kingdoms, bested by an animal he'd probably ridden since boyhood. The same beast that carried him into triumph carried him out of history. But if Alfonso was brought down by a beast's panic, the next king would die from within, ripped apart, not by hoof or blade, but by an ulcer that burst in silence. A royal implosion no one saw coming until it was far too late. King Stephen of England. King Stephen of England died, quite literally, from the inside out. Not from enemy steel or a well-placed dagger, but from something far more insidious, an ulcer that quietly bloomed into catastrophe, rupturing deep within him like a betrayal from his own organs. For a man whose reign was one of near-constant civil war, chaos, and contested legitimacy, it is almost fitting that his death came not in battle, but in a drawn-out, invisible siege inside his own gut. Stephen, who reigned from 1135 to 1154, is best remembered for his role in the anarchy name history has given to one of England's most dysfunctional power struggles. When his uncle, King Henry I, died without a male heir, the throne was meant to pass to Henry's daughter, Empress Matilda. But Stephen, ever the opportunist, rushed to London and had himself crowned. It was a bold, possibly reckless move, and it plunged the kingdom into nearly 2 decades of dynastic warfare. His reign became a tug-of-war, not just between two claimants, but between order and collapse. Castles were built, burned, rebuilt again. Nobles shifted allegiance like coin in a tavern game. Stephen was captured. Then Matilda was captured. Then everyone simply grew tired. By the 1150s, England was exhausted, and so was Stephen. When Matilda's son, the future Henry II, landed in England with an army, Stephen, grieving the recent death of his own son and heir, finally agreed to a truce. He would rule until his death, and then the crown would pass peacefully to the House of Anjou. Peace, it turns out, came too late for Stephen himself. In 1154, while traveling in Kent, Stephen fell ill. Sources vary on the specifics, but most agree he suffered from severe abdominal pain, likely caused by a perforated stomach ulcer. Today, it would be treated with relative ease. Back then, it was a death sentence. The rupture caused internal bleeding and infection, leading to a painful decline marked by fever, weakness, and eventually, collapse. He died in Dover, far from the halls of Westminster, with a legacy as tangled as the intestines that betrayed him. Stephen's death was not glorious, but it was conclusive end to a reign defined by inconclusion. The crown passed, at last, without bloodshed. But if Stephen's end was one of internal betrayal, the next king's demise would be a twist of cruel irony slain not by foreign foes, but by his very own guards, men he trusted from a culture he welcomed, until they turned King Ladislaus IV of Hungary. Some kings are assassinated by their enemies, others are betrayed by their advisors. But King Ladislaus IV of Hungary holds the rare distinction of being murdered by his own bodyguard's mercenaries he had handpicked, elevated, and trusted more than his nobles. They were his shield, his inner circle, his chosen men. And when they killed him in 1290, it wasn't just a betrayal of loyalty, it was a grim punchline to a reign already teetering between defiance and disaster. Ladislaus IV, also known as Ladislaus the Cuman, was never fully accepted by the aristocracy he ruled. His mother was a Cuman princess, descended from the nomadic Turkic tribes who had migrated into Hungary as part of a delicate alliance. From the beginning, Ladislaus walked a tightrope between two worlds, the feudal expectations of Christian Europe and the looser, more fluid traditions of the Cuman steppe. When he came to the throne as a child, the tension was academic. As he grew older, it became explosive. Rather than embrace the rigid etiquette of Hungarian court life, Ladislaus surrounded himself with Kumanshi's mother's people. He adopted their dress, their customs, and most controversially, their warriors. These men became his personal guard, his confidants, his preferred company. It was a gesture of identity and rebellion. To the Catholic Church and the Magyar nobility, it was heresy and treason rolled into one. Accusations of paganism followed him throughout his reign. The Pope excommunicated him. His own nobles refused to follow his commands. Even in times of crisis, Hungary seemed less like a kingdom and more like a patchwork of sullen allegiances and unspoken grudges. And then, somewhere on the plains near Karoseg, it all ended. Ladislaus was traveling, perhaps inspecting territory, perhaps evading political fallout when he was attacked by a group of Cumans in his own service. The motive remains unclear. Some say it was a personal dispute. Others suspect it was a plot, orchestrated by nobles who had finally lost patience and whispered promises into mercenary ears. Regardless, the result was undeniable. The king was cut down by those who had once guarded his life. No grand funeral, no royal procession, just a body in the dust and a silence thicker than any eulogy. Ladislaus's death wasn't just a political murder, it was a cultural severing, a king caught between identities, ultimately rejected by both. And if his end came by trusted hands turning against him, the next monarch's fate would taste even more bitter poison slipped by a servant, betrayal brewed into a drink meant to soothe, but stirred to kill. King Guntram of Burgundy. King Guntram of Burgundy, a 6th century Frankish ruler with a penchant for diplomacy and the occasional dramatic curse, was not the kind of monarch one expected to be brought down by drink. He wasn't a wild hedonist or a reckless glutton. In fact, by Merovingian standards, where royal family dinners frequently ended in fratricide, Guntram was practically a saint. The church certainly thought so. They canonized him after his death. But sainthood, it turns out, offers no immunity from poisoned wine poured by a vengeful hand. Guntram ruled during a time when the map of post-Roman Europe was less a continent and more a collection of familial grudges divided by rivers. He came to power in 561, inheriting the Kingdom of Burgundy after the death of his father, King Clotaire I. The Merovingian dynasty, known for its soap opera bloodlines and short tempers, had a habit of slicing up kingdoms and then spending the next generation trying to sew them back together with violence. Guntram, surprisingly, was different. He preferred peace, negotiation, even forgiveness on alien concept among rulers whose favorite pastime was plotting the deaths of their cousins. But that didn't mean his court was free of intrigue. Guntram was known to have many enemies, and not just from rival kingdoms. His reign saw rebellions, betrayals, and plenty of internal dissent. His attempts at centralizing power and curbing noble influence and noble, in both senses of the word, did not sit well with the old guard. Among them were servants, with long memories, bruised pride, and access to the royal table. According to several medieval sources, Guntram was poisoned by a drink, possibly wine served by one of his own. The specifics are lost to time, clouded by hagiography and the Church's eagerness to portray his death as martyrdom, but the suggestion of foul play was strong enough to echo through chronicles for centuries. A servant, perhaps acting on orders, offered the fatal cup. The king drank, and soon after, he began to die. It wasn't immediate. It rarely is. Poison, especially the slow-acting kind favored by courtiers with patience, creeps. Symptoms would have started subtly: fatigue, nausea, confusion. Then came the pain, and then silence. Guntram died in 592 and was soon venerated as a saint. Miracles were attributed to his relics. His death, while murky in detail, was elevated in meaning. But behind the incense and iconography was a simple, chilling truth. Even a king known for mercy can be murdered quietly by someone who knew when he'd be thirsty. And if betrayal in a chalice sent Guntram to sainthood, the next monarch would chase sainthood too. Only his came after the battlefield, after death, and after his body refused to rot. King Olaf II of Norway. In the grand theater of royal deaths, few exit the stage with both a blade in their chest and sainthood in their future. King Olaf II of Norway, better remembered as Saint Olaf, managed to achieve both. He died in battle, exiled from his own kingdom, rallying a final charge against his usurpers. That alone might have granted him a small shrine in the saga of fallen kings. But the strange part came after the sword, after the burial, after the rot should have set in but didn't. Olaf Haraldsson, born around the year 995, was a Viking-turned-Christian king in an era when the two identities were barely compatible. He ruled from 1015 until 1028, and during that time he tried to drag Norway, sometimes literally, into Christianity. This was not a gentle sermon in the town square sort of process. Olaf's conversion efforts came with burned pagan temples, forced baptisms, and a sharp drop in religious tolerance. Unsurprisingly, this made him wildly unpopular with many of the local chieftains who enjoyed both their old gods and their independence. Eventually, those chieftains had enough. With the backing of Danish King Canute the Great, yes, the same Canute who tried to command the tide, they forced Olaf into exile. He fled east, biding his time in the lands of Kievan Rus, sharpening his resolve and, presumably, waiting for divine signs that vengeance was permissible under Christian doctrine. In 1030, he returned to Norway with a small army, hoping to reclaim his throne. He was met at the Battle of Stiklestad by a coalition of his enemies, many of whom had once been his allies. The battle was fierce and fatal. Olaf fought bravely, but he was eventually struck down, according to sagas, by multiple blows, including a spear to the gut, an axe to the leg, and finally, a fatal wound to the throat. But it's what happened after that turned a failed king into a legend. His body, buried in Nidaros, modern-day Trondheim, was exhumed a year later, according to chroniclers who, to be fair, had every reason to embellish. His corpse was found uncorrupted. No rot, no stench. His skin reportedly looked fresh, his hair longer, even his nails grown. In medieval Europe, this was not cause for suspicion. It was a miracle. Olaf was swiftly canonized as a saint. The church grew rich on his relics. Norway rallied around his name. The man who had once been too Christian for the Vikings and too Viking for the Christians became a national symbol. But if Olaf's body refused decay, The next king's body would prove far more vulnerable, falling to a lowly crossbow bolt in a siege no one expected to matter, ending the story of a lion-hearted king not with a roar, but with infection, King Richard I of England. For a monarch famously called the Lionheart, King Richard I of England died not like a beast in battle, but like a man distracted at the wrong moment, outside a nowhere castle in the French countryside. There was no grand campaign, no legendary duel, just a petty siege, a rebellious noble's stronghold, and a single crossbow bolt fired, some say, by a boy. A king whose myth towered across continents fell to a minor wound that festered quietly until even his myth couldn't save him. Richard was no stranger to war. He lived for it. His reign was forged in blood crusades, rebellions, sieges, and scars, all stitched into the coat of arms he wore like a second skin. He was a man of action, rarely in England, and rarely still. He spent more time abroad than on the throne he technically ruled, chasing glory in the Holy Land, outmaneuvering rivals in France, and writing his legacy one campaign at a time. He was adored by knights, feared by enemies, and tolerated by his subjects, most of whom never saw him except in taxes. In 1199, Richard was in Aquitaine, campaigning to suppress a local uprising. One of the rebel strongholds was a minor fortress called Chalais-Charbrola, small strategic bump on the map, hardly worthy of royal attention. But Richard was there, overseeing the siege personally, because even after years of warfare and survival, he still couldn't resist the pull of battle. Or perhaps he thought himself invincible. He'd survived captivity in Austria, ambushes, and betrayals. What could possibly go wrong at a backwater castle? While inspecting the walls, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt in the shoulder. It wasn't a kill shot. Not immediately. The wound was reportedly minor. But medieval medicine had a way of turning scratches into death sentences. The arrow was removed poorly. The wound became infected. Gangrene set in. Within days, Richard, lion-hearted king, who had once stood against Saladin, was dying from a filthy wound at a forgettable siege. The young archer who fired the bolt was captured, and here the stories diverge. One account says Richard pardoned him on his deathbed, showing mercy. Another says the boy was flayed alive. History, as usual, offers both justice and revenge, and lets us pick whichever we prefer. Richard died in his mother's arms, in a foreign land, far from the throne and legend he'd chased his whole life. But if Richard's body was undone by a single wound, the next king's blood would be spilled in a power struggle so iconic it became myth as death, not just a political murder, but the beginning of a Shakespearean echo that would last for centuries. King Duncan, I of Scotland. Long before his name became theatre, King Duncan I of Scotland was a real man, an early medieval ruler with the misfortune of being remembered not for how he lived, but for how he died. Or rather, for how someone else retold his death centuries later, draped in soliloquies and supernatural fog. Shakespeare gave us the doomed, gentle Duncan murdered in his sleep by Macbeth, a man poisoned by ambition and a very talkative wife. But history, as always, is less poetic and more chaotic. Duncan reigned from 1034 to 1040, a relatively short tenure by royal standards, made even shorter by the fact that he was, quite literally, too ambitious for his own good. Contrary to the stage version, Duncan wasn't exactly an elderly, beloved monarch. He was young, energetic, and aggressive, more hot-blooded than holy. He came to the throne at a time when the Scottish kingship was still in flux, its legitimacy built as much on military dominance as on bloodline. In other words, being king meant fighting to stay king. Duncan had a claim, yes, But so did others, including Macbeth, a powerful noble with royal ancestry through his mother and political strength in the north. For a while, the two coexisted. But things began to unravel when Duncan launched an ill-fated military expedition into Moray Macbeth's territory. It was a bold move, possibly born from insecurity or a desire to solidify power before challenges could rise. It backfired spectacularly. At the Battle of Pitgavany, or Bothnegowan depending on your preferred chronicle, Duncan's forces clashed with Macbeth's. It wasn't a midnight murder in a castle, it was open warfare. Duncan was killed in the fighting, perhaps in single combat, perhaps surrounded. There was no dagger in the dark, no treacherous banquet, no howling witches. Just a battlefield, a rival, and a king who lost. Macbeth then took the throne not as a usurper sneaking through halls, but as a victor claiming spoils. And by many accounts, he ruled effectively for nearly 2 decades. Duncan's own son, Malcolm, would eventually return to avenge his father, killing Macbeth and reclaiming the throne. That story, in turn, would become legend, then propaganda, then Shakespeare. But back in 1040, there was only a fallen king on a field in Moray, and a man who seized opportunity by the throat. And if Duncan's end became the stuff of drama, the next king's demise would be wrapped in irony of a darker kind, because when a monarch dies of dysentery, it's not just the body that purges, but the legacy. King Dagobert I of the Franks. It's not often that a king dies of dysentery and ends up a saint, but King Dagobert I of the Franks, a 7th century ruler whose reputation straddled the line between decadent and devout, managed to do both. His reign was filled with contradictions. A deeply pious man known for founding churches, yet equally famous for his appetites, for food, for wealth, for women. His death, when it came in 639, wasn't accompanied by sword or scandal. It was far messier than that. Messier, and strangely symbolic. Dagobert ruled over the Merovingian dynasty, a line of Frankish kings so drenched in blood and intrigue they made the later Capetians look like a book club. Unlike many of his predecessors, Dagobert had a mind for unification. He worked to consolidate his father's divided realm, bringing Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy under his command. For a time, he was one of the most powerful monarchs in Western Europe. But even a powerful king must eat, and Dagobert was said to enjoy his meals with royal enthusiasm. It wasn't just food. Dagobert lived large. He built grand palaces, filled them with opulence, and surrounded himself with mistresses and flatterers. His court was known for excess, banquets that lasted for days, entertainers by the dozens, and a treasury that seemed to groan under the weight of its own decadence. It's no surprise that his body began to rebel. Over time, his health weakened. His indulgences took their toll. He died from dysentery, most likely a result of his extravagant diet, made worse by medieval hygiene and a medical system that believed bleeding a man might cure diarrhea. The end was undignified, violent, lonely. For all his grandeur, he passed not on a throne, but likely in a sickbed, losing fluids and coherence until his body simply gave out. But death did not bury him, it elevated him. Posthumously, Dagobert was honored for his religious donations and his support of the church. Hagiographies appeared, miracles were whispered, and in time, he was venerated as a saint, his sins politely ignored in favor of his piety, a king who dined like a glutton but died like a martyr. Even the abbey at Saint Denis, where French kings would be buried for centuriousry to polish his legacy, casting his image in stained glass as a noble penitent. But behind every glowing pane lies the messy truth, a man undone not by battle, but by bowels. And while Dagobert's end came from within, the next monarch would fall to the sharpest point of ceremonial theater, his eyeball punctured not by fate, but by a friend, in a joust meant only for show. King Henry II of France. If royal deaths had a flair for the cinematic, then King Henry II of France's final scene was nothing short of brutal Ironia monarch, slain not by sword in war, nor by poison in court, but by the splintered lance of a celebratory joust. A pageant of chivalry gone horribly wrong. It was meant to be sport. It became spectacle. And in the end, it was a cautionary tale carved into the eye socket of a king who should have known better. Henry II reigned from 1547 to 1559, a time of religious tension and political tightrope walking in France. He was a Renaissance, king-cultured, athletic, authoritative with a fondness for tournaments and a deeply complicated marriage to Catherine de' Medici. Politically, he steered France through the eddies of Reformation chaos, battling both external enemies like the Habsburgs and internal ones like the spread of Protestantism. But for all his accomplishments, Henry was also a man driven by ritual, by image, by pageantry. And so, when his daughter Elizabeth was married to Philip II of Spain, Henry decided to mark the joyous union with a tournament days of jousting, feasting, and festivity. The field was filled with galloping knights and glittering armor, a theater of martial bravado designed to show off the strength of France and, of course, the virility of its king. Henry, ever the showman, took to the lists himself. At 40, he was no longer the golden youth he once was, but he was still strong, still proud, and still eager to prove his mettle. His opponent, Gabriel de Montgomery, a nobleman and officer of the Scottish Guard. The first passes were clean, but in one fateful round, Henry raised his visor, some say, out of vanity, to better see the crowd. The lances struck. Montgomery shattered on impact. A long splinter drove through the king's eye, piercing deep into his brain. He didn't die instantly. Instead, he lingered for 10 agonizing days, shovering between lucidity and torment. Surgeons probed the wound, cauterized tissue, drained fluid. Nothing helped. Infection set in. Delirium followed. Finally, the king died, his brain ravaged, his court shaken, and the symbolism too, on the nose to ignore. A king blinded by pride, literally and fatally. Henry's death marked more than the loss of a monarch. It signaled the unraveling of royal confidence. His son Swick, sickly or easily manipulated, would rule in his shadow as France stumbled into decades of religious war. And while Henry died with splinters in his skull and his dynasty unraveling, the next king's demise would be a slow-motion tragedift, not by fate or weapons, but by heartbreak, grief, and a death perhaps quietly willed into being. King Leopold I of Belgium. King Leopold I of Belgium didn't die on a battlefield, nor at the hands of revolutionaries. His death was quiet or clinical, even, but beneath the somber routine of royal decline was something more elusive. A man who simply gave up. Officially, Leopold died of natural causes in 1865. But behind the medical reports and funeral rites, there were whispers that the king's stoic, measured, calculating had lost the will to live, that grief had done what no army ever could, that he didn't die from anything so much as he died after everything. Leopold's reign began not with bloodline, but with negotiation. He wasn't Belgian. He wasn't even the first choice. A minor German prince from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Leopold was selected in 1831 to become the first king of the Belgianza newly minted nation, desperate for a monarch to balance its fragile independence from the Netherlands. He took the throne reluctantly, but ruled with an iron sense of stability, threading the needle between French and Dutch interests, Protestant and Catholic factions, liberal dreams and monarchist fears. For over 3 decades, Leopold was the cold center of Belgium's carefully neutral orbit. He advised Queen Victoria, his niece, influenced continental diplomacy, and never strayed far from the chessboard of European politics. But his public reserve concealed private sorrow. His first wife, Princess Charlotte of Wales, died in childbirth. He mourned her for the rest of his life. His second marriage to Louise of Orléans brought children and a more grounded domestic life, but Louise's death in 1850 reopened the wound. Then came the death of his son, Leopold, Duke of Brabanther to the throne, bearer of legacy, and some say, the last flickering light in the king's life. When the boy died of pneumonia at 9 years old, something inside the king seemed to fracture. Leopold aged rapidly after that, withdrawn, distant, physically frail, yet stubbornly still in power. Courtiers noted his melancholy, ministers covered for his apathy. His once razor-sharp correspondence became curt, distracted, and resigned. And while doctors attributed his death to heart failure, many suspected that he had simply let Gownwilling to play the part anymore. He died on the 10th of December, 1865, and Belgium mourned him like a steady pillar crumbling overnight. His son, Leopold II, would succeed him and become infamous in ways his father never imagined. But if Leopold I's end was a slow surrender to grief, the next king's death would be anything but Passavian assassination soaked in irony, desperation, and a last-minute scramble through a blocked toilet pipe that sealed his fate forever. King James I of Scotland. Most royal assassinations happen in court shadows or battlefield chaos, but King James I of Scotland died trying to escape through a sewer. Not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, a literal sewer. And if that sounds like the grim punchline to a life of paranoid politics and dynastic vendettas, it absolutely is. Because James didn't just dare, was hunted, cornered, and butchered in his own chambers after frantically trying to pry open a waste pipe he had personally ordered sealed. Royal irony doesn't get sharper than that. James I ruled Scotland from 1406 to 1437, but he spent the first 18 years of his reign in English captivity. Captured as a boy en route to France, he was held by the English crown while Scotland spiraled through regencies and internal feuds. When he finally returned home as a man in his 30s, he came back with ideas about kingship, reform, and more importantly, control. And control he did, ruthlessly. James slashed through the Scottish nobility like a man making up for lost time. He imposed taxes, reined in lawless barons, executed potential rivals, and attempted to centralize power in a kingdom built on grudges and grudging allegiances. His reforms made Scotland more stable, but also far more tense. The king's court became a boiling pot of loyalty, fear, and barely veiled resentment. So it's not entirely surprising that in 1437, while staying at the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, James was the target of a well-planned assassination. The conspiratorial by Sir Robert Graham and members of the Albany Stuarts, a rival branch of the royal family, slipped into the monastery on a February night, blades in hand and blood in their eyes. James, alerted too late, tried to escape. His guards had been neutralized, the doors were compromised, and the building's exits were few. In desperation, he ripped up floorboards and dropped into a sewage tunnel beneath the chambers, a medieval escape route. Clever except that James had recently ordered that very pipe sealed to stop tennis balls from getting lost under the floor. Yes, tennis balls. That's not a euphemism. When the assassins burst into the room and realized where he'd gone, they followed. Trapped in the pipe, James was dragged out and stabbed to death multiple times, with ceremonial overkill as rain ending in a sewage channel he himself had sabotaged. It was violent, ironic, and oddly Shakespearean. And yet, as macabre as his death was, the next royal demise would somehow be even quieter, strangerless of a bloodbath, more of a mystery wrapped in a robe that burst into flames.